The explosion tore through dimensional barriers like tissue paper. And for one impossible moment, Clark Kent existed in two realities at once. He'd been stopping a LexCorp weapons test in Metropolis when the experimental device, something involving boom tube technology and apocalyptic energy signatures, had detonated. The blast should have killed thousands. Instead, it ripped him from his universe and hurled him through the screaming void between worlds. He crashed through what felt like a mirror made of starlight. The bridge of the ISS Enterprise materialized around him in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Superman's impact cratered the deck plating, and as he rose from the wreckage, the first thing he noticed was the screaming. A Vulcan officer hung suspended in some kind of torture device, a booth, crackling with electrical agony, while uniformed humans watched with expressions ranging from boredom to satisfaction. The Vulcan's green blood dripped onto pristine white deck plating. The second thing Superman noticed was the bodies. Two crew members lay dead near the turbolift, phasers still smoking in their hands. An assassination attempt interrupted by his arrival. Intruder on the bridge. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding. Security, converge on. Superman moved faster than their eyes could track, crushing the torture device with his bare hands and catching the Vulcan as he collapsed. The officer's face was a map of burns. His Starfleet uniform. No, it was similar but wrong, somehow darker, more militaristic, torn and bloodied. "You're safe now," Superman said quietly, lowering the Vulcan to the deck with gentleness. That seemed to shock the bridge crew more than his impossible entrance. A man stepped forward from the command chair, mid-30s, handsome in a dangerous way, with eyes that calculated threat assessment even as his hand rested on a golden phaser. His uniform bore captain's braids, but there was something predatory in his bearing that set Superman's instincts screaming. This wasn't a Starfleet officer. This was something wearing the uniform. "I am Captain James T. Kirk of the Imperial Starship Enterprise," the man said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "You've just destroyed Imperial property and interfered with an interrogation. That's punishable by death." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "But I'm a reasonable man. Identify yourself, and perhaps we can discuss how you might serve the Empire instead." Superman stood slowly, placing himself between Kirk and the injured Vulcan. The bridge crew had drawn weapons, phasers. He recognized the basic design from Justice League files on Parallel Earth technologies, all aimed at his chest. He could hear their heartbeats, rapid with adrenaline and something else. Excitement. They wanted him to resist. "My name is Superman. I'm not from your universe, and I don't serve empires." He met Kirk's gaze steadily. "But I will help anyone who needs it, starting with getting this man medical attention." Kirk's smile widened. "Superman, how delightfully theatrical." He gestured lazily, and the weapons didn't lower. "Dr. McCoy, you heard our guest. Tend to the Vulcan traitor. Keep him alive for now. I want to see what else our visitor can do." A man emerged from the turbolift, older, with sharp features and a medical scanner in hand. But his eyes held none of the warmth Superman associated with healers. This doctor approached the Vulcan like a scientist approaching a specimen, and the tricorder scans felt clinical, detached from the suffering they documented. Superman's X-ray vision swept the ship in seconds. 300 crew members, 72 aliens in the lower decks, Andorians, Tellarites, more Vulcans, all wearing collars. Slave collars. His jaw tightened. The ship's corridors were decorated with weapons, not art. The brig held prisoners suspended in those same torture booths. And in one cargo bay, he saw something that made his stomach turn: rows of neural suppression helmets, designed to strip sentient beings of their free will. This wasn't Starfleet. This was an abomination wearing its skin. "I can see you're processing information rapidly," Kirk observed, circling Superman like a shark. "Enhanced senses? Telepathy? Whatever method you're using, you're realizing that you're not in your Federation anymore." He practically spat the word. "The Terran Empire doesn't negotiate with aliens. We conquer them. We use them. And when they're no longer useful." He gestured to the viewport, where a planet hung in space, beautiful, blue and green, achingly familiar to Earth. "That's Vulcan. We've been mining its dilithium for decades. The population has been reduced to manageable levels." Superman's fists clenched. Through the viewport, he could see orbital platforms bristling with weapons, all aimed downward. Subjugation from above. He'd seen this before. Apocalypse, Warworld. Every tyrant who'd ever pointed guns at the helpless from orbit. "You're slavers," Superman said quietly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Kirk laughed. "We're conquerors. There's a difference. Slavery implies we see them as equals degraded to servitude. We simply recognize the natural order. Humanity is superior, and the galaxy is ours to command." He leaned forward, voice dropping to something almost intimate. "But you're human, aren't you? I can see it, despite the circus costume. Which means you understand. Power isn't given. It's taken. And you, my friend, have power written in every molecule of your being." A female officer, African heritage, beautiful and deadly, stepped forward with a device that hummed with exotic energy. "Captain, bioscanners are reading impossible cellular density. He's generating his own energy field. And the power output." She looked up, eyes wide. "Sir, if these readings are accurate, he could destroy this ship with a breath." Kirk's expression didn't change, but Superman heard his heartbeat spike, not with fear, but with hunger. Could he now? How fortuitous. The captain's hand moved to a control on his chair. "Superman, I'm going to make you an offer. Join the Terran Empire. With your powers serving our expansion, we could conquer the entire Alpha Quadrant within a year. I'd make you an admiral, grant you your own fleet. You could have anything, worlds, riches, subjects to do your bidding." "I don't want subjects," Superman said. "I want you to free the people you've enslaved and stop threatening that planet." The bridge fell silent. Then Kirk threw back his head and laughed. Genuine, delighted laughter that sent chills down Superman's spine. "Oh, you're serious. You actually believe in the old myths, justice, freedom, mercy." He shook his head, still grinning. "Doctor, preliminary assessment. Is he insane?" McCoy had finished his cursory examination of the Vulcan and now approached Superman with his tricorder humming. "Brain activity is off the charts, but organized. No signs of psychosis. He appears to genuinely believe what he's saying, Captain. Some kind of moral conditioning, perhaps? Or he's from a reality where such naive philosophies actually function." "Fascinating." Kirk's smile turned cold. "Let me educate you about reality, Superman. In this universe, mercy is weakness. Compassion is exploitable. And hope." He pressed a button on his chair, and the view screen shifted to show a Vulcan city, ancient architecture that reminded Superman of Candor, with Imperial troops marching through. Streets lined with bodies. "Hope is what we crush first. It makes the conquest smoother." Superman's eyes began to glow red. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Kirk noticed the heat building in Superman's eyes and held up a hand. "Before you do something rash, consider this. You destroy this ship, and the orbital platforms automatically bombard Vulcan. We built failsafes for mutinies. My death triggers the death of millions. And even if you're fast enough to stop that, and I'm genuinely curious if you are, the Empire spans dozens of systems, hundreds of ships, thousands of installations. Can you be everywhere at once?" The red glow faded, but Superman's voice was steel. "I've heard that speech before. From every dictator who thought power made them invincible. It never ends well for them, because they faced conventional opposition." Kirk spread his hands. "You're not conventional. You're a god among insects. Why waste your time protecting the insects when you could rule them, shape them, make them better through strength? Isn't that more efficient than this inspiring people to be better nonsense? I've seen the Vulcans try logic. The Betazoids try empathy. The Federation try diplomacy. They all fell because force is the only language the universe understands." Superman looked at the captain of the ISS Enterprise, this twisted reflection of heroism, and felt something shift in his chest. A cold realization that in this universe, humanity had been given the stars and chosen to paint them red. Every worst impulse, every brutal instinct, every darkness that his adopted world fought to transcend. Here, they'd embraced it, made it doctrine, built an empire on it, and they were winning. "I understand now," Superman said quietly. "You think this is strength, but I've seen real strength. It's not in domination. It's in restraint. in choosing mercy when you have the power to destroy, in protecting the weak not because they're useful, but because it's right. Kirk's expression hardened. Then you're a fool, and fools don't survive in the Empire. He pressed multiple buttons on his chair. All hands, battle stations. We have a hostile alien aboard. Containment Protocol 7. Transwarp to Imperial Center. The Emperor will want to see this. The ship lurched as it jumped to warp, and Superman felt the dimensional fabric strain around him. He was being carried deeper into this nightmare universe, farther from any hope of returning home. But as he looked at the injured Vulcan, now being dragged away by guards, and thought of the millions suffering under this Empire's boot, he realized something. He'd crashed into hell itself. And Superman didn't abandon people in hell, even if hell was wearing Starfleet's face and calling itself humanity's destiny. The stars streaked past the viewport, distorted by faster-than-light travel. And Superman made his choice. He couldn't conquer this empire. That would make him the very thing he opposed. He couldn't destroy it. Genocide was genocide, even against slavers. But perhaps, impossibly, he could do what he did best. Give them something they'd forgotten existed. Something this dark mirror of humanity had never truly known. Hope. The ISS Enterprise's bridge hummed with malevolent efficiency as it tore through subspace toward the heart of the Terran Empire. Superman stood motionless in the center of the command deck, surrounded by a dozen armed guards whose phasers never wavered from his chest. He could disarm them all in a heartbeat, literally, but Kirk's threat hung in the air like a blade against innocent throats. Orbital weapons, automated extermination protocols, the brutal mathematics of hostage-taking on a planetary scale. He'd faced this before. Darkseid's Omega sanctions, Mongols' warworld controls. But those had been obvious monsters. This was humanity wearing the monster's face and calling it evolution. Approaching Imperial Center, announced the helmsman, a young man whose uniform bore bloodstains that hadn't been fully cleaned. Routine, Superman realized with disgust. Violence, so normalized it didn't warrant fresh clothing. The view screen revealed Earth. His breath caught despite everything. Continents in familiar configurations. Oceans reflecting starlight. The curve of atmosphere that humanity had looked up at for millennia before learning to reach beyond it. But as his vision telescoped closer, the wrongness crystallized. Orbital weapons platforms surrounded the planet like a crown of thorns. The night side blazed with cities, but the light was harsh. Industrial, no warm glow of homes. Only the cold illumination of surveillance and control. And in geosynchronous orbit above what should have been North America, a space station loomed, massive beyond anything the Federation ever built, bristling with weapons and adorned with an emblem that made Superman's stomach turn. A golden Earth, wrapped in chains, beneath a bloody sword. Beautiful, isn't it? Kirk had moved to stand beside him, gazing at the homeworld with something approaching pride. The Terran Empire's throne, where humanity first looked at the stars and decided they were ours. He glanced at Superman. Your Earth must be different. Softer. Tell me, in your reality, did humans actually waste centuries on cooperation and understanding before claiming their birthright? We spent centuries learning that strength without wisdom is just brutality. Superman replied, not taking his eyes from the planet. And that our birthright isn't domination. It's the potential to be better than our worst instincts. Kirk snorted. Philosophy, the opiate of the weak. He turned to his communications officer. Uhura, Signal Imperial Command. Inform them Captain Kirk has captured an extra-dimensional being of significant strategic value. Request immediate audience with. Captain, Uhura interrupted, her hand pressed to her earpiece, face gone pale. Imperial Command is. They're not responding to standard channels. I'm picking up emergency frequencies. Multiple ships converging on Imperial Center. And sir, she looked up, genuine fear breaking through her professional mask. There's a rebellion fleet in the system. They're attacking the orbital platforms. The bridge erupted into controlled chaos. Tactical displays lit up with red warning indicators. Through the viewport, Superman saw flashes of weapons fire, disruptor, beams lancing between starships, and defense satellites. A Vulcan cruiser, primitive, compared to the Enterprise, but flying. Colors of red and gold defiance, traded. Fire with an Imperial destroyer. He watched as the Vulcan ship's shields collapsed in phaser. Fire carved through its hull, bodies venting into space before emergency force fields engaged. Battle stations. Kirk snapped, dropping into his command chair like a predator coiling to strike. Scotty, I need full power too. Weapons. Sulu, get us between those rebel ships and the Emperor's station. We're not letting these slaves ruin my presentation. Superman's X-ray vision swept the battlefield. 3 Vulcan ships, 2 Andorian cruisers, and a motley collection of converted freighters, maybe 20 vessels, total against the 100-plus Imperial warships defending Earth. It wasn't a battle. It was suicide. And yet they fought with desperate fury, ramming when their weapons failed, continuing to fire even as their ships broke apart around them. Why are they doing this? Superman asked quietly. They can't win. Kirk's laugh was sharp and bitter. Because they're fools who believe in you. What? Did you think your little display at Vulcan went unnoticed? Kirk gestured at a tactical screen showing FTL communication intercepts. Within an hour of you destroying that agony booth, every rebel cell in the quadrant was broadcasting about a liberator from beyond the stars, a being of impossible power who protects slaves. You became their messiah, Superman. And like all messiahs, you inspired your followers to throw away their lives for nothing. The words hit like kryptonite. Superman stared at the dying ships and realized with horror that Kirk was right. Those Vulcans, those Andorians, they were dying because he'd shown them someone with power who didn't use it to crush them. He'd given them hope, and hope in this universe was a death sentence. Get me a communication channel to those ships, Superman said urgently. Absolutely not. Kirk's phaser was suddenly in his hand, aimed not at Superman, but at the communications console. You'll order them to stand down, and I won't permit that. Those rebels are solving their own problem by concentrating in one location for easy extermination. An Andorian frigate exploded on the view screen, its warp core breaching in a miniature star. Superman heard the screams through the subspace channels before they cut off. 43 heartbeats, gone in an instant. His eyes began to glow. Phaser the alien. Kirk barked, but Superman was already moving. He covered the distance to Kirk faster than the bridge crew could process, plucking the phaser from the captain's hand and crushing it into metallic powder. Then he was at the helm, pulling the navigation officer aside with sufficient force to be clear, but not enough to harm. I'm sorry, Superman said, hands already manipulating controls with speed that left afterimages. But I can't let them die for me. You don't know our systems. Kirk started, then fell silent as the Enterprise's trajectory shifted with impossible precision. Superman's superspeed and enhanced mental processing had analyzed the ship's operational parameters in seconds. His fingers danced across Cardassian-derived tactical interfaces as he'd been using them for years. The Enterprise dropped out of warp, directly between the rebel fleet and the Imperial destroyer squadron preparing to finish them. Superman routed auxiliary power to shields, maximizing defensive coverage, and opened communication channels across all frequencies. This is Superman to all ships, Rebel and Imperial. Stop firing immediately. His voice, carried by the Enterprise's powerful transmitters, flooded every bridge in the system. On the view screen, he could see ships hesitating, weapon cycles pausing. To the rebellion, I didn't come here to lead you. I came here by accident, and I will not let you die because of my actions. Stand down. Retreat. Survive to fight another day with strategy, not sacrifice. And to the Terran Empire, his voice hardened. I am placing myself between you and these ships. If you want to destroy them, you'll have to go through me first. And I promise you, that will not end the way you think. Silence on the bridge. Kirk's face had gone through shock, to fury, to something approaching. Calculated respect. You magnificent idiot, the captain breathed. You just declared war on the entire empire to protect slaves you don't even know. No, Superman corrected, still monitoring the tactical displays. I declared that some lines can't be crossed. Not while I'm here to stop it. The communications console crackled. A voice, deep, resonant, carrying absolute authority that made Kirk actually straighten in his chair. This is Emperor Spock of the Terran Empire. Identify yourself, vessel protecting the rebel fleet. Superman's enhanced hearing caught Kirk's sharp intake of breath and whispered conversations across the bridge about the Emperor, personally responding. Through the view screen, he saw the massive orbital station's weapons. Arrays powering up, enough firepower to sterilize continents. I am Superman, from another universe. I have no quarrel with you, Emperor. But I will not stand by while ships are destroyed for seeking freedom. A pause. Then, fascinating. Captain Kirk, you have captured an extra-dimensional entity whose moral programming directly contradicts the Empire's fundamental principles, and your first action was to bring him to Imperial Center during a rebellion. Your tactical incompetence is matched only by your opportunistic ambition. Kirk's face flushed, but he remained silent. Superman, Spock continued, your interference has created a diplomatic paradox. By your own admission, you oppose our Empire's methods. By your actions, you possess sufficient power to disrupt our operations. Standard Imperial protocol demands your immediate execution. However, logic suggests that a being capable of intercepting and piloting the Enterprise within seconds would be challenging to eliminate. I propose an alternative. I'm listening, Superman said warily. Transport to the Imperial Palace. Alone. We shall discuss your situation rationally and determine whether your presence in our universe serves any logical purpose beyond martyrdom. In exchange, I will order a ceasefire. The rebel ships will be permitted to retreat unmolested. Kirk leaned forward. Your Majesty, with respect, allowing rebels to. Captain Kirk, you will remain silent, or I will have Commander Sulu assume command. Your glory-seeking has been noted. Spock's voice carried the edge of a blade. Wrapped in velvet. Superman, you have 30 seconds to decide. Accept my offer, or I will be forced to conclude that your heroism is merely tactical manipulation, and respond accordingly. Superman looked at the rebel ships, damaged, weapons depleted, crews exhausted. Then at the Imperial fleet, weapons locked and waiting. He'd bought them time, but time alone wouldn't save them. They needed a promise from someone who could enforce it. And there was something in Spock's voice. Logic, yes, but beneath it, curiosity. The same quality he'd heard in his universe's Vulcans when they encountered something that challenged their understanding. If this Emperor was truly Vulcan, truly logical, then perhaps there was a chance for something other than violence. I accept, Superman said. But I want your word, as Emperor, as a Vulcan, that those ships go free. No pursuit, no delayed retaliation, no accidents in neutral space. Another pause. You negotiate like a Federation diplomat. Irritating, but noted. Very well. You have my word as Emperor. The rebels may retreat. My word, Superman, is logical. Breaking it would cost more than honoring it. Kirk made a disgusted sound. McCoy, who'd been watching from his medical station, shook his head. You're walking into a cage, Superman. The Emperor doesn't grant audiences. He collects specimens. Then he's about to learn that some specimens don't stay in cages. Superman replied. He turned to Kirk. I'm sorry about your ship. I'll try to fix the console I damaged. Don't bother, Kirk said coldly. When you're dead, I'll have your corpse mounted in my quarters as a reminder of what happens to idealists. In the real universe. Superman met his eyes. I've heard variations of that threat from better monsters than you, Captain. It never works out the way they plan. He walked to the transporter pad, surrounded by guards, who kept their weapons trained on him, but whose hands shook slightly. As the transporter chief, an older human with scars marking decades of service, worked the controls. Superman took one last look at the bridge. Captain Kirk, he said quietly. In my universe, there's a James T. Kirk. He's one of the bravest, most principled men I've ever heard of. He explored strange new worlds not to conquer them, but to understand them. He sought out new life and new civilizations not to enslave them, but to befriend them. He proved that humanity could be great not through force, but through compassion. Kirk's expression twisted. Then he was weak. No, Superman said as the transporter beam began to take him. He was strong enough to be kind. There's a difference you've never learned. The Enterprise dissolved around him, and reality shifted. When it reformed, Superman stood in a throne room that stole his breath. The Imperial Palace's audience chamber was a cathedral to power. Obsidian pillars rose toward a vaulted ceiling where stars had been holographically projected, the entire galaxy, with Terran-controlled systems glowing red like drops of blood across the spiral arms. The floor was polished marble inlaid with precious metals, forming a map of Earth. And at the room's far end, on a throne that somehow managed to be both elegant and threatening, sat a Vulcan. Emperor Spock was older than the Spock Superman had heard of, gray streaking his dark hair, lines etched around his eyes. He wore robes of deep crimson trimmed with gold, and a medallion bearing the imperial seal rested against his chest. But it was his eyes that captured Superman's attention. They held the familiar Vulcan intelligence and control, but beneath that surface, Superman's enhanced perception detected something else. Doubt. Emperor Spock rose from his throne with fluid grace. Descending steps carved from what appeared to be Vulcan granite, a deliberate choice. Superman realized, displaying dominion over even the homeworld's stone. Guards lined the chamber's perimeter, holding agonizer batons that crackled with neural disruptors. But it was the figure standing to the Emperor's right that made Superman's enhanced vision focus sharply. A human woman, mid-40s, wearing the uniform of an Imperial Admiral with commendations that spoke of countless campaigns. Her eyes were cold calculation incarnate, and she studied Superman like a xenobiologist, examining a specimen that might need to be vivisected or weaponized, possibly both. Admiral Saavik, Spock said without turning, you may lower your hand from your phaser. If our visitor intended violence, we would already be experiencing it. The woman's hand moved away from her weapon, but her tactical assessment never wavered. Half human, half Vulcan. Superman's hearing detected. Her heartbeat carried both species' rhythms, fighting for dominance. Approach, Spock commanded, and Superman walked forward, his cape flowing behind him. He stopped at what he judged respectful distance, close enough for conversation, far enough to not present threat. Though in truth, distance meant little when he could cross the space between them faster than thought. Spock's eyebrow rose fractionally. You maintain diplomatic protocols, even in a universe where such courtesies are typically preludes to assassination. Curious. Where I come from, respect costs nothing and earns trust, Superman replied, even when trust is in short supply. Indeed. Spock descended the final steps, and Superman was struck by how the Emperor carried himself, regal, authority balanced with something almost like weariness. I have reviewed Captain Kirk's logs. Your arrival, your power demonstration, your refusal of Imperial service, and your protection of rebel forces. From a purely logical standpoint, you represent either the greatest threat to Imperial stability in a century, or the greatest asset. I invited you here to determine which. I'm neither, Superman said. I'm someone who was brought to your universe against my will, and who can't stand by while people suffer. That's not a threat or an asset. That's just who I am. Admiral Saavik stepped forward. Your Majesty, his psychological profile suggests dangerous messianic tendencies. Subject demonstrates pathological altruism inconsistent with self-preservation instincts. Recommend immediate containment and study. His cellular structure alone could advance our weapons development decades. Superman's jaw tightened. I'm not a weapon. Everything is a weapon if applied correctly, Saavik replied coldly. Your biology, your moral code, your power, all exploitable resources. The Empire has built itself on understanding this fundamental truth. Admiral, Spock said quietly, you presume I have reached a conclusion. I have not. He turned his full attention to Superman, and those dark eyes seemed to pierce through flesh to examine the soul beneath. Superman, an appellative that suggests superiority over baseline humanity. Do you consider yourself superior? The question hung in the air like a blade. Superman had answered, variations of it thousands of times, from Lex Luthor's accusations to Batman's contingencies to his own midnight doubts. But here, in a universe where superiority was doctrine, where might made right, and the strong ruled the weak by design, the answer carried different weight. I have abilities that most humans don't, Superman said carefully. That makes me different, not superior. I was raised by farmers who taught me that power without responsibility is tyranny, and that everyone, regardless of their abilities, has equal worth. Where I come from, we believe all people are created equal. A noble fiction, Spock observed, yet demonstrably false. Beings vary in intelligence, strength, moral capacity. The Terran Empire simply acknowledges this inequality and structures society accordingly. Humans possess qualities that make them effective administrators and conquerors. Therefore, humans rule. Is this not logical? No, Superman said firmly. Because you're measuring the wrong things. You're weighing physical power and tactical cunning, but ignoring compassion, creativity, cooperation, the things that actually build civilizations instead of just conquering them. Spock's expression remained neutral, but Superman caught the micro-expression, a fractional narrowing of the eyes that suggested he'd struck something deeper than expected. You speak of cooperation, yet your universe presumably contains conflict, war, suffering. How is cooperation superior if it fails to eliminate these conditions? Because we're trying, Superman said. We struggle, we fail, we get back up and try again. That struggle makes us grow. Your empire eliminated the struggle by deciding only one way exists: humanity on top, everyone else beneath. You stopped growing the moment you embraced that lie. Admiral Saavik moved to interrupt, but Spock raised a hand. Continue. Superman took a breath, aware that what he said next might determine not just his fate, but the fate of those rebel ships still retreating. Still believing he represented hope. I've met Vulcans in my universe. They're remarkable people, logical, yes, but that logic led them to peace. They nearly destroyed themselves with war and emotion run wild. So they chose a different path. They built a civilization based on infinite diversity in infinite combinations. They proved that logic and compassion aren't opposites, they're partners. Something flickered across Spock's face. For just an instant, the Imperial mask cracked, and Superman saw raw hunger, not for power, but for validation of a doubt that must have gnawed at this emperor for decades. The Vulcans of this universe, Spock said quietly, were conquered because their pacifism made them vulnerable. Their logic rendered them incapable of defending themselves against human aggression. They died by the billions before the survivors accepted their place in the imperial hierarchy. How is this proof of logic's superiority? It's proof that your humans chose violence over understanding. Superman countered. In my universe, humans first met Vulcans after a terrible war. They could have responded with fear and aggression. Instead, they chose curiosity. They learned. They grew. Together, they founded something called the Federation, an alliance of equals, working toward common good. The Federation, Spock repeated, and Superman heard contempt drip from the word. Yes, in this universe, the Federation existed briefly. A weak coalition of species who believed diplomacy could counterforce. The Terran Empire crushed it within a decade. Their idealism made them predictable. Their mercy made them exploitable. Their equality made them paralyzed by committee. They were logically inferior. Were they? Superman challenged. Or were they just unprepared for people who'd throw away every principle for short-term gain? Your empire won battles, Emperor Spock. But did it win the future? Are your people happy? Are they fulfilled? Or do they spend every moment watching their backs, knowing assassination is policy and betrayal is rewarded? Admiral Saavik's hand had returned to her phaser. Your Majesty, he's attempting to undermine imperial ideology. This is sedition. This is debate, Spock corrected. Something increasingly rare in imperial circles. He circled Superman slowly, hands clasped behind his back, a gesture Superman recognized from his universes. Vulcans, the posture of deep contemplation. You present an interesting paradox, Superman. You possess godlike power yet advocate for equality. You could conquer our empire within days, yet you negotiate. You preach compassion, yet I observe significant anger in your physiological responses to imperial practices. Tell me, have you never been tempted to impose your will on a population for their own good? The question cut deep because Superman had faced that temptation. The injustice timeline, where another Superman had made that choice. Every time he'd wanted to silence Lex Luthor permanently. Every dictator he'd wanted to topple instead of trusting humanity's institutions. Every moment he'd wondered if the world would be simpler, if he just made the hard decisions for everyone. Every day, Superman admitted. Every single day, I'm tempted to take control, to end wars by force, to eliminate evil, to shape the world into something better. The power to do it is literally in my hands. Spock stopped circling, facing him directly. Yet you refrain. Why? Because the moment I decide I know better than everyone else. The moment I impose my vision of good on people without their consent, I become a tyrant. And tyranny is tyranny, even when it's done with good intentions. Superman met the Emperor's gaze. I've seen what happens when someone with power decides they're the only one wise enough to rule. I've seen the injustice timeline, where Superman tried to force peace on the world. He saved lives in the short term, and he destroyed everything heroic about himself in the process. Heroism, Spock said softly. Another concept without logical foundation. Heroes sacrifice for others. Logically, self-preservation should supersede altruism. Yet you act against self-interest consistently. This suggests either programming I cannot detect, or you are operating on principles that transcend pure logic. There's a logic in compassion, Superman insisted. A civilization that protects its weakest members, that values every life, that builds up instead of tearing down, that civilization grows stronger. Your empire built itself on slavery and conquest. How long can that last? How many rebellions will you crush before the math stops working? Admiral Saavik answered before Spock could. Forever. The empire has existed for centuries and will exist for millennia. Rebellions are manageable statistical anomalies. Our superior technology, tactical doctrine, and willingness to use any means necessary ensures perpetual dominance. Does it? Superman turned his X-ray vision on the palace structure, seeing beyond walls to the machinery maintaining the Emperor's throne. Neural suppression fields, automated defense systems, agonizer booths in the dungeon levels where prisoners screamed in darkness, and deeper still, in shielded chambers. He saw research laboratories where Vulcan, Andorian, and Tellarite scientists worked under guard, forced to develop weapons that would be used against their own people. He saw the Empire's truth. It wasn't sustained by strength, but by fear, by torture, by the constant threat of annihilation, keeping everyone, human and alien alike, too terrified to imagine alternatives. Your empire is a cage, Superman said quietly, and you're locked inside it just like everyone else, Emperor. You sit on that throne surrounded by people who'd murder you the instant they sensed weakness. You rule through terror because trust is impossible in a system built on betrayal. You've conquered the galaxy and imprisoned yourself. The throne room fell silent. Guards tensed. Admiral Saavik's phaser cleared its holster. But Spock held perfectly still, his expression unreadable, and when he spoke, his voice carried something Superman hadn't heard yet. Uncertainty. You claim to see through walls, Spock said. What else do you see, Superman? What do your enhanced perceptions reveal about this Emperor you're lecturing? Superman studied the Vulcan before him with every sense at his disposal. Enhanced vision showed the microtensions in Spock's musculature, stress carried for decades. Hearing detected a heartbeat that was too controlled, suggesting constant mental discipline to maintain emotional suppression. And there, in the Emperor's eyes, Superman saw what he'd glimpsed earlier but now understood fully. Doubt, exhaustion, and buried beneath layers of Vulcan control, hope. Hope that someone, somewhere, might prove him wrong about the universe's cruelty. I see someone who's been alone for a very long time, Superman said gently. Someone who inherited a monster and convinced himself he had to become one to control it. Someone who uses logic as armor, because admitting he feels would mean admitting he suffers. And I see someone who wanted me to come here not to judge if I was a threat, but to find out if I was real, if compassion could actually exist in something powerful enough to survive your universe. Spock's control slipped. Just for an instant, emotion broke through, raw, desperate, and quickly suppressed. But Superman had seen it. And from Admiral Saavik's sharp intake of breath, she'd seen it too. Your Majesty, Saavik said carefully, if you're considering his proposition, I must remind you that ideological reform has been attempted 17 times in imperial history. Each attempt resulted in civil war, reduced territory, and eventual reversion to traditional doctrine. The empire's structure is optimized for its current function. Attempting to. I am considering nothing, Admiral, Spock said, his voice once again perfectly controlled. I am engaging in logical analysis of an unprecedented variable. He turned back to Superman. You have presented interesting philosophical arguments. However, philosophy does not alter material reality. This empire controls 53 inhabited systems. It fields 3,000 warships. It has maintained stability for 2 centuries. What could you possibly offer that would justify disrupting this equilibrium? A choice, Superman said simply. I can't conquer your empire. I won't. That would make me everything I oppose. But I can show you there's another way. I can demonstrate that strength and compassion aren't opposites. That mercy isn't weakness. That the future you're building, where everyone lives in fear and dies plotting betrayal, isn't the only option. Demonstrate how? Spock asked. By protecting rebels? By interfering with Imperial operations? Such actions would require the Empire to eliminate you as a threat, resulting in a confrontation that benefits no one. Superman smiled sadly. Emperor Spock, I've faced challenges like this before. Situations where power alone couldn't solve the problem, where I had to prove that ideals matter, that principles are worth upholding even when they're difficult. In my universe, I'm called Superman not because I'm better than humans, but because I try to inspire them to be their best selves. To prove that no matter how dark things get, hope survives. Hope, Spock repeated. The irrational belief that outcomes will improve despite evidence to the contrary. No, Superman corrected. The rational choice to act as though better outcomes are possible, because that action itself creates the possibility. Your empire has spent 2 centuries proving that brutality works. Let me show you what happens when someone proves compassion works just as well. And if you fail? Spock asked. If your compassion results in your death and accomplishes nothing but providing the empire with an interesting autopsy. Superman's smile widened, and for the first time since arriving in this dark mirror universe, he felt something like confidence. Then at least I'll have tried. And sometimes, Emperor, trying is what plants the seeds that grow long after the planter is gone. Spock studied him for a long moment, Vulcan logic warring with something deeper, something that Superman recognized because he'd seen it in his own face during the darkest moments. The desperate, terrifying, irrational desire to believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe could be better than it was. I will grant you an opportunity, Spock said finally. Not because I believe you will succeed, but because logical analysis suggests your failure will provide valuable data about the limits of idealism against organized power. He gestured, and a holographic display materialized between them. A star system with multiple planets. The Rigel system, contested territory where rebellion has recently flared. The Empire has scheduled orbital bombardment of Rigel 7 to eliminate resistance. 10 million colonists will die to eliminate approximately 50,000 rebels. Superman's fists clenched. That's genocide. That is efficiency, Admiral Savick corrected. Acceptable losses to ensure compliance across 12 other systems. Standard Imperial doctrine. I'm offering you a test, Spock continued. Travel to Rigel. Resolve the rebellion without violence. Demonstrate that your compassion achieves superior results to our methods. If you succeed, I will delay further bombardments and grant you audience to present your philosophy formally. If you fail, he paused, the bombardment proceeds, and you will either accept Imperial service or be eliminated. Do you accept these terms? It was a trap. Superman knew it immediately. Spock was giving him an impossible task: resolve a rebellion where both sides had legitimate grievances, prevent violence in a system built on violence, all while Imperial forces watched for any excuse to prove idealism failed. And even if Superman succeeded, the Emperor could simply declare victory conditions unmet. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to prove that another way existed. And more importantly, it was 10 million lives hanging in the balance. I accept, Superman said, but I have one condition. Spock's eyebrow rose. You are not in a position to negotiate. You gave me a test. I'm adding a clause. If I succeed, truly succeed, by preventing both the bombardment and the rebellion, through peaceful means, you agree to meet with representatives from the Vulcan, Andorian, and Tellarite resistance. Just meet them. Hear their grievances without retaliation. Let them speak freely for 1 hour. Impossible, Savick interjected. Protocol forbids the Emperor from granting audience to enemies of the state. Yes, Spock finished. However, if Superman's methodology proves superior to bombardment, then by definition, those he resolves conflict with are no longer enemies. They are subjects successfully pacified through alternative means. His eyes glinted with something that might have been humor. Your logic is sound, Admiral, but requires adaptation to unprecedented circumstances. Savik looked like she wanted to argue further, but subsided with visible effort. Very well, Spock said. Succeed at Rigel, and I will grant your audience. Fail, and 10 million die as testimony to idealism's futility. He gestured, and guards moved to escort Superman to the transporter. You have 72 hours before the bombardment fleet arrives. I suggest you use them wisely. As Superman was led from the throne room, he heard Spock's voice one final time, so quiet that only Kryptonian hearing could detect it. I almost hope you succeed. The alternative has become tiresome. Superman smiled grimly. The Emperor of the Terran Empire had just admitted he was tired of the monster he'd become. That was a crack in the armor, a fracture in the absolute certainty that kept this nightmare functioning. It was, in its own way, hope. And Superman knew how to work with hope, even when it was barely a whisper in the darkness. The Rigel system materialized around Superman as he dropped out of the Imperial Transport's transporter beam. He hung in the vacuum of space, cape billowing in solar wind from the blue giant star that gave this sector its name. 7 planets orbited Rigel in configurations that spoke of ancient terraform efforts. 3 of them showed signs of civilization. But it was Rigel 7 that commanded his attention. The planet was beautiful from orbit. Vast oceans separated by archipelagos of volcanic islands. Polar ice caps gleaming white against turquoise seas, and in the equatorial band, sprawling cities that blended organic architecture with industrial development. Population centers glowed in the twilight zone where day met night. And Superman's enhanced vision tracked millions of heartbeats, countless lives going about their evening routines, unaware that their existence had been scheduled for termination in 72 hours. But it was what surrounded the planet that made his jaw tighten. 16 Imperial warships held high orbit, weapons ports open and targeting solutions locked on every major population center. Constitution-class heavy cruisers, Miranda-class destroyers, and at the formation center, an Excelsior-class dreadnought whose torpedo bays could crack continents. The ISS Relentless, according to the transponder codes Superman intercepted. Captain Garth of Azar commanding, a name that carried weight even in the brief hours Superman had spent in this universe. A tactical genius who'd conquered 18 systems and whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him like the bow wave of a tsunami. Superman's calm badge, grudgingly provided by Admiral Savik before his departure, crackled to life. Unidentified individual maintaining orbital position. This is Captain Garth of the ISS Relentless. You are in restricted Imperial space during active military operations. Identify yourself immediately or be fired upon. Superman tapped the badge, grateful that Kryptonian lung capacity allowed speech in vacuum where sound couldn't travel. The device translated bioelectric neural impulses directly. This is Superman. Emperor Spock has granted me authority to resolve the Rigel situation. I'm requesting you hold bombardment and allow me to attempt negotiations. A long pause. Then Garth's voice returned, laced with barely concealed contempt. I received notification of your involvement. The Emperor's scientific curiosity apparently supersedes military necessity. Very well. You have 68 hours before my orders become active regardless of your interference. But understand this, Superman, the moment you fail, and you will fail, my ships will reduce every rebel stronghold to glass. The Empire does not negotiate with traitors. Noted, Superman replied, cutting the channel before Garth could elaborate on exactly how much he enjoyed bombardment duty. Superman descended toward Rigel 7, allowing himself to appreciate the simple physics of atmospheric entry. Friction heated his invulnerable skin, ionization trails painting colorful streamers across the upper atmosphere. And below, he could see the curve of the world resolving into topographical detail. Mountain ranges, river systems, agricultural zones, organized with geometric precision that suggested advanced irrigation. This was a developed world, not some primitive colony ripe for exploitation. His X-ray vision swept the surface, cataloging infrastructure. Fusion reactors providing clean power, maglev transit systems connecting cities, medical facilities, with equipment that wouldn't have been out of place in a Federation hospital, weapons manufacturing plants protected by shield generators. There. That was interesting. The rebels weren't just hiding. They were arming themselves, preparing for a fight they couldn't possibly win. And deeper, in underground complexes shielded against detection, Superman found them. The rebellion's heart. Thousands of people, human, Vulcan, Andorian, Tellarite, even a few Orion, working in converted mining tunnels. Some maintained aging starship components, cannibalizing civilian vessels to keep a handful of combat-capable ships running. Others trained with weapons, their forms showing the desperate intensity of people who knew they were learning to die rather than truly fight. And in the central chamber, a command center where holographic displays showed the Imperial fleet's positions and countdown timers that marked hours until annihilation. Superman selected a landing site, a plaza in the planet's capital city of New Rigel. It was evening, the local star painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and civilians were moving through what appeared to be a market district. Families, children, people living their lives in the shadow of orbital death, either unaware of their fate or choosing to spend their final hours in defiance of despair. He touched down gently, boots making almost no sound on the polished stone. Immediately, conversation stopped. Heads turned. A Tellarite merchant dropped the merchandise he'd been displaying. An Andorian mother pulled her child behind her, antennae rigid with alarm. "Please," Superman said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here to help." Help. A human man stepped forward, middle-aged, wearing work clothes stained with industrial lubricant, face weathered by labor. "We know who you are. The liberator from beyond the stars. The one who made the rebels think they had a chance, then got half their fleet destroyed at Earth. You're here to finish the job." The accusation hit harder than any physical blow could have. Superman forced himself to maintain eye contact, to not look away from the anger and betrayal written across these people's faces. "I never asked anyone to attack on my behalf. I never wanted. What you wanted doesn't matter." A Vulcan woman emerged from the crowd, her civilian robes marked with the insignia of what Superman recognized as a teaching order. Intentions are irrelevant. Consequences are logical. Your arrival inspired hope. Hope inspired action. Action inspired retaliation. The Imperial fleet arrived 3 days after news of you spread. We have been given 72 hours to surrender unconditionally or face orbital bombardment. You have helped us immensely. The words were delivered with pure Vulcan logic, without anger or accusation, which somehow made them worse. Superman had faced this before: collateral damage from his heroism, unintended consequences of his interventions, but never on this scale. Never where his mere existence had condemned millions. "Then let me fix it," Superman said. "I can negotiate with the Empire." "I can." "Negotiate what?" The human worker laughed bitterly. "Our surrender? Our return to slavery? My daughter was born free on this world. She's never worn a collar, never been forced to call a human master, never had her education limited to what the Empire deemed appropriate for non-humans. You think I'm going to negotiate away her freedom? There has to be another way," Superman insisted. "Some compromise that saves lives while preserving dignity. If I can just talk to your leaders, maybe we can." "Oh, you want to talk to our leaders?" A new voice, sharp with authority. The crowd parted, and a woman strode through. Human, early 30s, wearing the practical combat gear of a guerrilla fighter with a disruptor pistol holstered at her hip. Her face carried scars that spoke of close-quarters fighting, and her eyes held the hard certainty of someone who'd made peace with death. "I'm Colonel McKinnon, Rigel Defense Forces. And yes, Superman, we know all about you. The Emperor's pet project. His little test to see if mercy works better than bombardment." Superman's super hearing detected elevated heart rates throughout the crowd, and his tactical assessment warned him that at least 15 people within visual range were armed. This wasn't a welcoming committee. This was a potential firing squad waiting for an excuse. "I'm not the Emperor's anything," Superman said carefully. "I made a deal to try to save your world. If I can prove that peaceful resolution works, he'll agree to delay the bombardment and what? Slavery with better conditions?" McKinnon stepped closer. And Superman noted the way her hand rested casually near her weapon. We declared independence 18 months ago. We've built something here, a society where species doesn't determine worth, where children of any race can dream of any future, where the Vulcan philosophy of infinite diversity and infinite combinations actually means something. And you want us to give that up? I want you to live, Superman said. In 72 hours, Captain Garth is going to turn this world into a graveyard. I've seen his fleet. I've analyzed his weapons. There is no scenario where armed resistance succeeds. You need time. You need to build. We need you to leave. McKinnon's voice dropped to something dangerous. Your presence here proves to the Empire that we're important. Enough for special treatment. That makes us a target. If you actually want to help, disappear. Let them think we're just another backwater colony, not worth the Emperor's attention. But the bombardment is coming whether you interfere or not. McKinnon's control cracked, genuine fury breaking through. Do you understand? This isn't about you resolving anything. This is Spock testing whether your ideology can survive contact with Imperial reality. He's betting it can't. And when you fail, when the bombardment happens despite your best efforts, he gets to prove to himself that his way, the brutal, logical, efficient way, is the only way that works. You're not here to save us. You're here to be the Emperor's cautionary tale. The plaza had gone silent. Even the children had stopped playing. Sensing the adult tension crackling through the air, Superman looked at the faces surrounding him, Vulcan stoicism masking fear, Andorian antennae betraying emotional turmoil, Tellarite stubbornness refusing to show despair, and human expressions running the full spectrum from rage to resignation. They were right. McKinnon was right. Spock had given him an impossible task specifically designed to fail, to prove that compassion couldn't stand against organized violence. The Emperor needed Superman to fail, needed to validate decades of brutal rule by demonstrating that no alternative existed. But they were also wrong, because they didn't know what Superman knew. They hadn't seen what he'd seen in Spock's eyes, that flicker of desperate hope that maybe, impossibly, someone could prove him wrong about the universe. Colonel McKinnon, Superman said quietly, I understand your anger. I understand your fear. And you're right that I walked into a trap. But here's the thing about traps. They only work if you play by the trapper's rules. Emperor Spock expects me to either negotiate your surrender or try to fight the fleet directly. He's counting on me failing at both, proving that force is the only language that matters. So what's your brilliant third option? McKinnon demanded. Ask nicely. Hope the bombardment fleet has a change of heart. No, Superman said, and his eyes began to glow red, not with heat vision, but with reflected starlight, making them luminous in the gathering dark. I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to show everyone, you Spock, Garth, the entire Empire, that there's another way. Not through surrender, not through violence, through demonstration. Demonstration of what? The Vulcan teacher asked, logic warring with curiosity in her tone. Superman smiled, and for the first time since arriving in this dark universe, he felt the familiar surge of purpose that came from seeing a path forward. Of what's possible when someone with power chooses to use it for protection instead of domination. You said my presence made this world a target? Good. Let me make it a shield instead. He rose slowly into the air, cape billowing, addressing not just the crowd in the plaza, but using his voice to carry across the entire city. People of Rigel 7, I am Superman. I come from a universe where I've spent my entire life proving that power and compassion aren't opposites, where I've shown that protecting the vulnerable isn't weakness. It's the highest expression of strength. In my universe, there's a saying, hope shines brightest in the darkest night. You're living in the darkest night I've ever seen. So let me bring some light. He shot skyward, accelerating through the atmosphere in seconds, breaking orbital velocity with a sonic boom that rattled windows across 3 continents. The Imperial fleet sensors would have tracked him, would be reporting to Garth right now that the anomalous entity was taking hostile action. Good. Let them watch. Superman positioned himself in high orbit, directly between Rigel 7 and the ISS Relentless. His comm badge crackled immediately. Superman, this is Captain Garth. Stand down and return to the surface immediately. Your interference with military operations is Not interference, Captain, Superman interrupted. Insurance. For the next 72 hours, I'm going to maintain position right here, between your fleet and that planet. If you want to bombard Rigel 7, you're going to have to go through me first. You're insane, Garth said flatly. We have enough firepower to sterilize that world 16 times over. You think your body can absorb that much energy? I know it can, Superman replied calmly. I've survived worse. But here's what you need to understand. I'm not threatening you. I'm not attacking. I'm just standing in the way. Pure defense. If your orders require killing civilians, those orders now require killing me first. Are you willing to do that, Captain? Are you willing to murder someone who's doing nothing but protecting innocent people? Silence on the channel. Superman could imagine Garth's tactical mind racing through scenarios. Opening fire on Superman would either succeed, proving the Emperor's pet project could be killed, which would raise uncomfortable questions about why they'd let him operate freely, or fail, demonstrating that the fleet's weapons were ineffective, which would undermine the entire bombardment threat. Either way, Garth lost. I'm contacting the Emperor, Garth finally said. Your stunt is noted. When it fails, and you tire, and you're forced to either move or watch those rebels starve under blockade, we'll revisit this conversation. The channel closed. Superman allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd bought time, not much, but enough to work with. Now came the harder part. He activated his comm badge on a different frequency, one that would broadcast to the surface. Colonel McKinnon, I know you can hear this. I'm holding position in orbit. The fleet can't bombard while I'm here. That gives you and your people time. Not to surrender, not to prepare for a battle you can't win, but to think, to plan, to figure out what you actually want this world to become. McKinnon's response came after a long pause. And what do you expect us to do with this time? Write the Empire a strongly worded letter. I expect you to show me what freedom actually looks like, Superman said. I've seen slavery. I've seen the Terran Empire's version of order. Show me what you've built that's worth defending. Show me why this world deserves to exist. Not just survive, but thrive. Because when I make my case to Emperor Spock, I need to be able to tell him exactly what he's destroying and what alternative you're offering. You really think you can change a Vulcan's mind? The skepticism in McKinnon's voice was palpable. I think I can plant a seed, Superman replied. Whether it grows depends on soil that's been barren for a long time. But I've learned that the impossible sometimes happens when you're stubborn. Enough to try. He cut the channel and settled into position, cross-legged in the vacuum of space, capes spreading around him like a crimson shroud. The Rigel sun warmed his cells, solar radiation feeding Kryptonian biology with limitless energy. He could maintain this position for weeks if necessary, a living shield between genocide and innocent lives. But time was still the enemy. 72 hours to somehow transform a military standoff into what? He couldn't save these people by force alone. McKinnon was right. That would just prove the Emperor's point about power being the only thing that mattered. He needed to demonstrate something else, something that would make Spock question whether the Empire's foundational assumptions were actually logical. He needed to show that a society built on cooperation could be stronger than one built on conquest. And to do that, he needed to understand what Rigel 7 had actually built in its 18 months of freedom. Superman closed his eyes and listened, not just with his ears, but with every sense that made him who he was. He heard cities functioning, transportation systems moving people, hospitals treating patients, schools teaching children. He heard laughter, arguments, music, the cacophony of civilization that happened when people were free to live instead of merely survive. He heard hope, fragile, defiant, refusing to die even with extermination hanging overhead. And in that moment, Superman understood what his real mission was: not to negotiate Rigel's surrender, not to defeat the Imperial fleet, but to prove to Emperor Spock, too, a Vulcan who'd spent decades suppressing the part of himself that believed logic and compassion could coexist, that hope wasn't illogical. Hope was the most rational choice of all, because without it, what was the point of surviving? The ISS relentless weapons ports glowed in the darkness, targeting solutions locked on the anomalous Kryptonian who'd just declared himself humanity's shield. But they didn't fire. Not yet. Because Captain Garth, for all his tactical genius, had just realized what Superman already knew. In this moment, with the whole Empire watching, whoever struck first would lose. And Superman was very, very good at waiting. Emperor Spock received Captain Garth's report in his private chambers, a space that revealed more about the Terran Empire's ruler than any throne room ever could. The walls were lined with ancient Vulcan texts, philosophical treatises on logic and emotion, historical accounts of Zurich's reforms, mathematical proofs of ethical frameworks. But they shared shelf space with something darker: tactical manuals, interrogation protocols, and bound volumes documenting every assassination attempt against imperial authority in the past century. A being divided against himself, preserved in literature. He simply positioned himself as a barrier, Spock asked, reviewing the holographic display showing Superman's orbital vigil. The Kryptonian hadn't moved in 6 hours, maintaining perfect stationarity relative to Rigel VII's rotation. Yes, Your Majesty. Garth's image flickered in the subspace transmission, the captain's frustration evident. Despite his attempt at professional detachment, he's not threatening, not attacking, not even scanning our vessels aggressively. He's just there, blocking any firing solution that would reach the planet's surface. Admiral Saavik, present in the Emperor's chambers for strategic consultation, leaned forward. A calculated provocation. He forces us to either accept his interference or escalate to lethal force against a non-combatant. If we destroy him, we validate his narrative about Empire brutality. If we don't, we appear weak. Weakness, Spock repeated softly, his gaze distant. An interesting choice of terminology, Admiral. Is restraint weakness? Or is it strength under control? Saavik's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Your Majesty, with respect. Philosophical speculation is less relevant than tactical reality. Superman has disrupted military operations and emboldened the rebels. Every hour he remains in position without consequence is another hour the Empire appears indecisive. Spock turned from the display to face his admiral directly. And what would you recommend? Overwhelming force, Saavik replied without hesitation. Concentrate all 16 ships' firepower on his position simultaneously. Photon torpedoes, phaser arrays, even trilithium warheads, if necessary. Determine conclusively whether he can be destroyed. If yes, we eliminate the variable. If no, we at least establish tactical parameters for future encounters. You propose killing him, Spock said neutrally. I propose testing whether he can be killed, Saavik corrected. There's a distinction. He claims invulnerability. The scientific method demands we verify this claim empirically, through vaporization, through necessary force application. Saavik held the Emperor's gaze. Your Majesty, you granted Superman an opportunity to demonstrate his methodology. He has chosen a methodology that directly challenges imperial authority. The logical response is elimination. Spock's eyebrow rose fractionally. Is it? Consider the scenario, Admiral. We fire upon Superman with sufficient force to theoretically destroy a Constitution-class starship. Outcome 1. He survives, proving our weapons ineffective and demonstrating that imperial military supremacy has limits. Outcome 2. He dies, martyring him and validating rebel propaganda about Empire villainy. Outcome 3. He survives but retaliates, and we discover whether a being who can withstand orbital bombardment can also dismantle our fleet. He paused. Which outcome serves imperial interests? Saavik's jaw tightened. Then what do you propose? Allow him to maintain his blockade indefinitely. I propose, Spock said carefully, that we observe. Superman claims he can resolve the Rigel situation through demonstration, rather than force. Let us see what he demonstrates. Captain Garth, maintain your position, but do not fire unless Superman initiates hostilities. Make no threatening moves, but ensure full sensor coverage of both Superman and the planet's surface. I want to know exactly what he's attempting. Garth's hologram stiffened. Your Majesty, my orders were to pacify Rigel 7 through bombardment if they refused surrender. Superman's interference directly contradicts those orders. If I don't execute, your orders are now to observe and report, Spock interrupted, his tone carrying absolute authority. I am the Emperor. I may modify operational parameters as logic dictates. You will comply. Yes, Your Majesty. Garth's image disappeared, replaced by sensor telemetry from the Rigel system. Savik remained silent for a moment, then spoke carefully. Your Majesty, I must note that your behavior patterns have deviated from established norms since Superman's arrival. You granted him audience when protocol demanded immediate elimination. You accepted his test conditions when logic suggested rejecting them. And now you're countermanding tactical doctrine to accommodate his interference. I am concerned about potential psychological influence. Spock turned to face his admiral fully, and something in his expression made even the half-Vulcan warrior take an involuntary step backward. You believe he has compromised me mentally? I believe he represents a category of threat we've never encountered. Savik replied, not military, not political, but ideological. He challenges the fundamental assumptions upon which the Empire functions. That makes him more dangerous than any fleet. Precisely, Spock agreed, and Savik's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected accord, which is why eliminating him through force would be tactically insufficient. If his ideology has merit, and I am not conceding that it does, then destroying him merely postpones confronting the philosophical question he represents. But if his ideology is as flawed as I suspect, then allowing him to fail demonstrates its inadequacy more effectively than any bombardment could. Savik studied the Emperor with something approaching concern. You want him to fail. I need him to fail, Spock corrected quietly. For 200 years, the Terran Empire has operated on the principle that might makes right, that humans are superior, that compassion is exploitable weakness. If Superman proves otherwise, if mercy and cooperation can genuinely triumph over force and hierarchy, then every decision I have made, every action I have authorized, every death I have ordered has been. He paused, and for just an instant, his Vulcan control wavered. Has been logically unnecessary. The admission hung in the air between them. Savik's expression shifted through surprise to understanding, to something almost like sympathy. You're afraid he might be right. Fear is illogical, Spock said automatically, but his tone lacked conviction. I am uncertain, and uncertainty in an emperor is dangerous. Therefore, I must resolve this uncertainty definitively. Superman will either succeed at Rigel through methods that validate his philosophy, or he will fail and prove that imperial doctrine, however distasteful, remains the only viable option for maintaining order in a hostile universe. And if he succeeds? Savik asked quietly. Spock returned his gaze to the holographic display, where Superman remained in meditative stillness, a lone figure holding back an empire's wrath through nothing but positioning and principle. Then, Admiral, we will face a future more uncertain than any rebellion could create. Because if mercy works, if compassion proves effective, if cooperation succeeds where conquest struggled, then the Empire itself becomes obsolete. And beings made obsolete by history rarely go quietly. On Rigel VII's surface, Colonel McKinnon stood in the rebellion's underground command center, staring at the tactical display that showed Superman's position in orbit. Around her, staff officers and civilian leaders argued in a dozen voices about what the Kryptonians' intervention actually meant. He's bought us time, a Vulcan strategic analyst noted. 3 days minimum before any bombardment can proceed. We should use it to evacuate non-combatants. Evacuate where? An Andorian pilot demanded, antennae twitching with agitation. Every transport we have can maybe carry 10,000 people. We have 10 million colonists. The math doesn't work. Then we fight, a Tellarite weapons officer rumbled. Bring our ships out of hiding. Strike the Imperial fleet while they're distracted by Superman. Even if we only damage a few vessels, we'll have shown resistance. And proven Superman's philosophy wrong, McKinnon interjected sharply. The room fell silent. Don't you see? That's exactly what the Empire wants. For us to respond to a peaceful intervention with violence. It validates their entire worldview. That force is the only language that matters. That mercy is a tactical liability. That idealism can't survive contact with reality. So we do nothing? The Tellarite's voice carried genuine bewilderment. We watch Superman sit in space and hope the Empire develops a conscience. No, McKinnon said slowly, an idea forming. We do something much harder. We show them what we've built, what's actually worth defending. Not weapons or ships or tactical advantages, but the society we've created in 18 months of freedom. A human counselor, elderly, wearing the simple robes of a civilian administrator, spoke up. You want to invite Imperial observers to tour our colony? Colonel, that's suicide. They'll identify our entire infrastructure, map our defenses, target our leadership. They already know all that, McKinnon countered. Their sensors have been scanning us for 3 days. No, I'm not talking about showing the Empire. I'm talking about showing Superman. He said he needed to understand what we'd built. So let's show him. Not just infrastructure, the actual society. What life looks like when species doesn't determine destiny. The Vulcan analyst raised an eyebrow. A propaganda campaign aimed at a single individual? The efficiency of such an approach is questionable. Is it? McKinnon pulled up a different display. Intercepts of Imperial communications. Snippets of conversation between Emperor Spock and his advisors. Look at this. Spock isn't just testing Superman. He's testing himself. He's asking whether the Empire's foundations are actually logical or just brutally effective. Superman is the proxy for that question. If we can prove to Superman that freedom works, that cooperation succeeds, that diversity makes us stronger, we're really proving it to Spock. You're suggesting we attempt to convert the Emperor of the Terran Empire. The Tellarite said flatly. Through a demonstration. I'm suggesting we give Spock what every scientist needs, data that challenges his hypothesis. McKinnon's voice gained intensity. The Empire is built on the assumption that humans are superior. That force is necessary. That mercy equals weakness. We're a data point that contradicts all 3 assumptions. A colony where humans aren't in charge. Where we've maintained order without terror. Where compassion hasn't made us vulnerable. Where the experiment Spock needs to see. And Superman is our messenger. The elderly counselor stood slowly. In my youth, before the Empire, I studied pre-warp Earth history. There was a philosopher named Gandhi who proved that nonviolent resistance could topple empires, not through force, but through moral contrast. By being so visibly good that the oppressor's brutality became indefensible. He looked around the room. Perhaps Colonel McKinnon is suggesting we become the Empire's moral mirror. Force them to see what they've rejected. The Empire has no moral qualms about what it's rejected. The Andorian pilot said bitterly. They know what they've done. They chose it deliberately. Did they? McKinnon challenged. Or did they inherit a system built by previous generations and convince themselves it was logical necessity? Spock is Vulcan. Half Vulcan anyway. Vulcans value logic above all else. If we can prove logically that our way works better than theirs, then we're asking a being who's built his entire identity on the Empire's philosophy to admit that identity was mistaken. The Vulcan analyst said. The psychological resistance would be formidable, but not insurmountable, McKinnon insisted. Because Spock is also a scientist, and scientists, even Imperial ones, have to follow evidence. We just need to make our evidence impossible to ignore. A younger officer, human, barely out of his teens, spoke up hesitantly. Ma'am, even if this works, even if we convince Superman and somehow reach Spock, what happens after? The Empire won't just dissolve because one emperor has doubts. There are thousands of ships, millions of personnel, entire systems built around conquest and slavery. Changing one mind doesn't change the structure. McKinnon smiled grimly. No, but it's a start. Every revolution begins with one person saying this is wrong and refusing to pretend otherwise. Maybe Spock can be that person. And maybe, if the Emperor himself admits the Empire's foundations are flawed, she let the thought hang. Civil war, the Tellarite said bluntly. Half the Empire would support reform. Half would fight to maintain the status quo. Billions would die in the transition. Billions already die maintaining the current system. The elderly counselor countered. The question isn't whether change costs lives. The question is whether the cost of change is less than the cost of stagnation. McKinnon made her decision. We're doing this. Open a communication channel to Superman. Tell him we're ready to show him what freedom looks like. And prepare presentation materials. I want footage of our schools, our hospitals, our governance structures, our cultural exchanges. Everything that proves this colony isn't just surviving, it's thriving. We're going to give Superman the ammunition he needs to win an argument with an emperor. And if he loses that argument? The Andorian asked. Then we die knowing we tried, McKinnon said simply, which is still better than dying in silence. Superman received McKinnon's transmission while maintaining his orbital vigil. The colonel's voice carried a different tone than their first meeting, less hostile, more calculating, but also somehow more honest. Superman, this is Colonel McKinnon. You wanted to see what we've built? Fine. I'm transmitting coordinates for a series of locations across Rigel 7. Schools, hospitals, government facilities, residential districts. Visit them. Talk to people. See what a society looks like when it's built on cooperation instead of conquest. Then tell me whether this is worth defending. Superman opened his eyes, considering. It could be a trap, elaborate theater designed to manipulate him, painting a rosy picture while hiding darker realities. The Empire had conditioned him to expect deception in every interaction. But that was the Empire's logic. Fear everything. Trust nothing. Assume the worst in everyone. He'd spent his entire life proving there was another way. Acknowledged, Colonel, Superman replied. I'll visit your locations. But I need something in return, complete transparency. Show me everything. The good and the bad. If you're building something real here, it'll withstand honest examination. If you're just performing for my benefit, I need to know that too. A long pause. Then McKinnon's voice, carefully controlled, agreed. But Superman, when you see what we've accomplished, remember that every school you visit, every hospital, every family we've kept together, the Empire considers all of it illegal. They'd rather see it reduced to ash than admit it works. Then I'd better make sure I can explain it in terms even an emperor can understand. Superman said. He descended from orbit, leaving his post for the first time in hours. The Imperial fleet's sensors tracked him immediately, and Captain Garth's voice crackled across emergency channels, demanding explanation. But Superman ignored the hails. He had 66 hours left before the bombardment deadline, and he needed to understand what 10 million people had created in their brief taste of freedom. And more importantly, he needed to find the words to explain why hope wasn't just a logical sentiment, but the most rational choice conscious beings could make. Because somewhere above Rigel 7, an emperor sat in his chambers, surrounded by books on logic and treatises on conquest, asking himself the most dangerous question any tyrant can face. What if I was wrong? Superman's first stop was a school. The building sat on the outskirts of New Rigel, constructed from local stone and transparent steel. That let natural sunlight flood the classrooms. It was recess when he arrived, and the playground erupted in chaos, not of fear, but of excited recognition. Children of a dozen species stopped their games to stare at the red and blue figure descending from the sky like something from their storybooks. A young Andorian girl, no more than 7, ran forward before her teacher could stop her. Her antennae vibrated with excitement as she looked up at Superman with enormous eyes. Are you really from another universe? A universe where people don't have to be afraid. The question hit Superman harder than any weapon could have. He knelt down to meet her at eye level, aware that every child on that playground was watching, learning what power looked like when it chose gentleness. Yes, he said softly. In my universe, we've built something called the United Federation of Planets. Humans, Vulcans, Andorians, Tellarites, all working together as equals. It's not perfect. We still struggle, still make mistakes. But we try. And every day, we get a little better. My mother says that's impossible, the girl said, her antennae drooping slightly. She says humans always want to be in charge, that the Empire proved what humans really are. Superman glanced at the teacher, an older Andorian woman who was approaching cautiously, clearly ready to extract her student from potential danger. But he saw something in her expression beyond protective instinct. She was listening too, hungry for validation that the worldview she'd been forced to accept wasn't absolute truth. Your mother is wrong, Superman said, and felt the weight of that statement ripple across the playground. Humans aren't inherently cruel or dominating. In my universe, the worst atrocities were committed by people who convinced themselves that their way was the only way, that their species or ideology was superior. But we also had people who fought against that, who proved that humans could be better, not through force, but through choice. But you're human, a Tellarite boy called out, his natural argumentativeness overcoming his awe. You're stronger than everyone here. Why don't you just take charge? Tell us what to do. Because that's not strength, Superman replied, standing and addressing the entire playground now. Real strength is knowing you have power and choosing not to abuse it. It's protecting people without controlling them. It's using your gifts to lift others up, not push them down. He smiled. Besides, I've learned more from people who are different from me than I ever learned from people who are the same. Why would I want to rule when I can learn instead? The teacher finally reached them, placing a protective hand on her student's shoulder. But her voice, when she spoke, carried wonder rather than fear. In 18 months, this is the first time my students have heard those principles from someone who wasn't Rigelian. The first time they ve seen proof that the universe contains more than the Empire's version of humanity. What do you teach them? Superman asked. Everything the Empire forbids. She gestured to the school building. Comparative philosophy, multi-species history, mathematical proofs. That cooperation produces superior outcomes to competition in complex systems. Scientific method that questions authority rather than accepting it. We're raising children who think for themselves, who evaluate evidence, who understand that different doesn't mean inferior. Her antennae straightened with pride. We're raising citizens, not subjects. Superman's X-ray vision swept the school. He saw classrooms where human children sat beside Vulcan, Andorian, and Tellarite students, all learning from teachers of mixed species. He saw textbooks that celebrated diversity, artwork that depicted cooperation, science labs where students of different physiologies worked together on experiments that required their unique perspectives. And in the principal's office, he saw something that made his throat tighten, a wall of photographs. Graduation ceremonies from the past 18 months. Young faces, human and alien, wearing academic robes, holding diplomas, smiling with the pride of achievement earned rather than granted. Beside them, their parents stood with expressions Superman recognized from 1,000 graduation ceremonies in his own universe. Hope, pride, the fierce joy of seeing children reach futures that had been denied to their parents' generation. The Empire would destroy this, Superman said quietly. The Empire considers education of non-humans beyond basic technical training to be resource waste. The teacher confirmed. Under Imperial law, my students would be taught enough to operate machinery or follow orders. Nothing more. Their potential would be measured by their species classification, not their actual abilities. That's insane, Superman said. That's logic. A new voice, a Vulcan man in teacher's robes, approaching from the school building. Imperial logic, at least. If you assume humans are superior, then investing resources in non-human development is inefficient. The Empire isn't evil through irrationality. It's evil through following its assumptions to their logical conclusion. Then the assumptions are wrong, Superman countered. Obviously, the Vulcan teacher raised an eyebrow. But convincing Emperor Spock of that requires disproving 2 centuries of apparently successful policy. The Empire has conquered 53 systems. It maintains order. It advances human technology and territory. By its own metrics, it succeeds. At what cost? Superman gestured to the children, who were slowly returning to their games now that the initial excitement had faded. How many geniuses has the Empire lost because they were born the wrong species? How many scientific breakthroughs never happened because cooperation was forbidden? How many songs weren't sung, books weren't written, discoveries weren't made because the Empire decided that diversity was threat instead of strength? Mathematically incalculable, the Vulcan admitted, but also unprovable, as those losses are absences rather than presences. The Empire can point to its territorial expansion. We can only point to potential unrealized. A far weaker argument in utilitarian terms. Superman knelt again, this time to address a young human boy who'd been watching the conversation with unusual intensity. The child couldn't have been more than 5, but his eyes held intelligence beyond his years. What's your name? Marcus, the boy said softly. My parents are Imperial citizens. They defected here when I was born because they wanted me to grow up with Vulcan and Andorian friends. They said the Empire would teach me to hate, but Rigel would teach me to think. And what have you learned? Superman asked. Marcus considered the question with remarkable seriousness for a kindergartner. I learned that Trow, he's my Vulcan friend, is better at math than me, and that Shira, She's Andorian, runs faster. And that Grelmach, he's Tellarite, argues about everything, but he's never actually mean. He paused, then looked directly at Superman. The Empire says I'm supposed to be better than them because I'm human. But that doesn't make sense. They're better than me at lots of things. We're just different things. That's the smartest thing I've heard since arriving in this universe. Superman said, and meant it. The teacher smiled sadly. He won't be 5 forever. Eventually, he'll understand that his parents are traitors, that his friends are slaves in the Empire's eyes, that the society he's growing up in is scheduled for annihilation. How do we teach children hope when genocide is literally counting down in orbit? Superman stood, his jaw set with determination. By proving that hope wins. Come on, show me everything else. I need to see what you've built. Over the next 8 hours, Superman toured Rigel 7 with Colonel McKinnon as his guide. He saw hospitals where Vulcan neural specialists worked beside human surgeons and Andorian pharmacologists, combining their species' unique medical knowledge to achieve outcomes none could reach alone. He watched a surgery where a human doctor's steady hands, a Vulcan's telepathic monitoring of the patient's pain levels, and an Andorian's cold temperature, resistance for handling cryogenic equipment all contributed to saving a Tellarite child's life. He visited the Planetary Council, a governing body elected by popular vote regardless of species, where a Tellarite administrator argued vehemently with a human counselor about infrastructure funding, while a Vulcan chairperson mediated with patient logic. The debate was loud, passionate, sometimes verging on rude, but it was also genuine. Real disagreement between equals working toward consensus, not the careful deference of subordinates to masters. He toured manufacturing. Facilities were mixed species. Crews designed and built everything from agricultural equipment to starship components. A human engineer explained how Andorian cold tolerance allowed them to work with superconducting materials. A Vulcan systems analyst described how human intuition often spotted problems that pure logic missed. A Tellarite mechanic demonstrated how their natural strength made certain repairs feasible that would require complex machinery otherwise. Alone, we're competent, the human engineer said. Together, we're exceptional. The Empire sees diversity as complication. We see it as multiplication. Superman visited cultural centers where humans attended Vulcan meditation classes, where Andorians taught ice dancing to Tellarite students, where children of all species learned each other's languages and histories. He saw art galleries showcasing collaborative works, paintings, where human emotion, Vulcan precision, Andorian sensory perception, and Tellarite critique had combined to create something none could achieve individually. And everywhere he went, he heard the same theme repeated. This works. Against all imperial doctrine. Despite 2 centuries of propaganda claiming diversity weakens society, cooperation produces better outcomes than conquest. But he also saw the fear. The countdown was omnipresent, displayed on public screens, whispered in conversations, visible in the way parents held their children slightly tighter. Everyone knew they had less than 60 hours before the mathematics of orbital bombardment became relevant. As evening fell on Rigel VII's capital, McKinnon brought Superman to a monument in the city's central square. It was simple, a pillar of polished stone with names carved in dozens of languages. Thousands of names. The Liberation Memorial, McKinnon explained. Everyone who died freeing this world from imperial control. Humans who refused to be slavers. Vulcans who chose violence over logic for the only time in their lives. Andorians who sacrificed honor to achieve freedom. Tellarites who stopped arguing long enough to fight. Together, she touched one name, her fingers lingering. My brother. He died in the first hour, storming the imperial governor's compound. He was 19. Superman read the names with his enhanced vision, processing thousands of individual stories of sacrifice in seconds. Teachers who took up weapons. Merchants who became soldiers. Artists who died defending their studios. Parents who fought knowing they might leave children orphaned. The mathematics of revolution written and lives lost. We paid for this freedom in blood, McKinnon said quietly. Human blood, Vulcan blood, and Andorian. Tellarite. All the same color when it spills. All equally precious. All spent for the belief that maybe, impossibly, different species could build something better together than humans could build alone. She looked up at Superman. Was that naive? Were we fools to think 18 months of cooperation could stand against 2 centuries of imperial doctrine? Superman was silent for a long moment, processing everything he'd seen. The school where children learned that differences enriched rather than threatened. The hospital where medicine became art through collaboration. The council where debate was fierce but respectful. The factory where competence transcended species. The memorial where diversity united in sacrifice. No, he finally said. You weren't fools. You were brave. Because it's easy to accept the world as it is. It takes courage to believe the world can be different, and even more courage to make it different. He turned to McKinnon. But I need to ask you something honestly. Is this sustainable? If the Empire withdrew tomorrow, if you had peace and time, could this society survive its own growing pains? Or is this unity just desperation against a common enemy? McKinnon's laugh was bitter. Honest question deserves honest answer. I don't know. We've had 18 months of crisis mode. Everyone pulling together because the alternative is extinction. What happens when we have years? Decades? When humans get comfortable and start wondering why they're sharing power? When old tribal instincts resurface? When the first serious crime involves species conflict and everyone has to decide if they believe in equal justice or just equal slogans? She shook her head. I don't know if we'd survive our own success, but I know we'd try. And that's more than the Empire's ever done. That's all anyone can do, Superman said. Try, fail, learn, try again. My universe isn't perfect. We've had wars, betrayals, species conflicts, genocides. But we kept trying to be better. That's what makes a civilization worth defending. Not that it's perfect, but that it's dedicated to improvement. His calm badge crackled. Captain Garth's voice, cold with authority. Superman, this is the ISS Relentless. You've been absent from your blockade position for 8.3 hours. During that time, we've repositioned our fleet. We now have firing solutions on every population center you've visited. If you attempt to block all of them, you'll fail. Return to your previous position, or we'll interpret your absence as surrender of your shield strategy. Superman's eyes glowed red. You're threatening to murder children I just spoke with. I'm implementing tactical doctrine, Garth replied. The Empire doesn't negotiate with rebels, and it doesn't respect shields made of individual bodies, no matter how powerful those individuals are. You have 30 minutes to resume blocking position, or we fire. McKinnon's hand went to her sidearm. An automatic and completely useless gesture. We need to evacuate the school. There's no time, Superman said. And nowhere to evacuate to. Garth has firing solutions on everywhere I've been, which means he's been tracking me. Realization dawned, cold and clarifying. This was the test. Spock wanted to see if I'd leave my post to investigate Rigel's society. He predicted I would, because compassion requires understanding context. And the moment I left to develop that understanding, I opened tactical vulnerabilities. So you failed his test, McKinnon said flatly. No. Superman rose into the air, cape billowing in the evening wind. I passed it, because now I understand what I'm protecting. Now I can explain to Spock exactly what he's destroying and why it matters. Now I have the evidence to prove that his Empire's assumptions are wrong. That won't stop the bombardment. Watch me, Superman said, and vanished. He moved faster than Garth's sensors could track, positioning himself simultaneously in 3 locations, splitting his flight path into figure eights that placed him between the fleet and every major population center in rapid succession. To the ISS Relentless targeting computers, it appeared as though multiple entities were blocking their firing solutions. Confusion rippled through the Imperial fleet's tactical networks. Superman's voice filled every Imperial ship's bridge. Captain Garth, inform Emperor Spock that I'm ready for my audience. I've seen what Rigel has built. I can now demonstrate, with evidence, why this society deserves to exist. Tell him I'm prepared to make my case. And tell him that if he refuses to listen, I'll consider it proof that his empire doesn't operate on logic at all, just on fear of being proven wrong. In the Imperial Palace on Earth, Spock received the message in his meditation chambers. He sat in the traditional Vulcan posture, fingers steepled, mind disciplined against the chaos of emotion. But Superman's challenge had found its mark. Admiral Savik, Spock said quietly, activating his calm. Prepare the throne room. We're granting Superman his audience. It's time to resolve this experiment definitively. Your Majesty, he hasn't prevented the bombardment. He hasn't resolved the rebellion. By every objective measure, he's failed your test. Has he? Spock stood, moving to the window that overlooked the Imperial City's lights. Or has he simply redefined the test parameters? Superman doesn't believe in winning through force. He believes in winning through persuasion. Very well, let him attempt to persuade. He turned to face Savik. And prepare yourself, Admiral. If he succeeds, if his arguments prove logically sound, we may be forced to confront possibilities we've spent lifetimes denying. And if he fails? Savik asked. Then we fire, Spock said simply. And prove, once and for all, that mercy is a luxury the universe cannot afford. The throne room of the Imperial Palace had been transformed. Where before only Spock, Savik, and guards had stood, now dozens of observers filled the chamber, carefully selected. Representatives of the Terran Empire's power structure, admirals in military dress uniforms, their chests adorned with medals earned through conquest, governors from conquered worlds, humans all whose authority rested on the Empire's willingness to enforce their rule through violence, scientists from Imperial research facilities, where alien subjects provided data through involuntary experimentation, and at the chamber's periphery, communication officers maintaining real-time feeds to every major Imperial installation across 53 systems. This wasn't a private audience. This was a trial, and the entire Empire would bear witness. Superman materialized in the transporter beam, appearing at the chamber's center in a flash of golden light. He took in the assembled power of the Terran Empire. With a single glance, the hostile faces, the weapons held ready, the palpable anticipation of watching idealism break against reality's stones. But he also saw something else. Emperor Spock sitting perfectly still on his throne, hands clasped, expression neutral, but his eyes betraying the faintest hint of desperate curiosity. A man hoping to be proven wrong about everything he'd built his life defending. Superman. Spock's voice carried across the chamber with absolute authority. You requested this audience to demonstrate that the Rigel 7 colony deserves preservation over pacification. The Empire's leadership is assembled to evaluate your argument. You have 1 hour. Present your case. Superman stepped forward, his cape settling around him. He noticed that no one had offered him a place to stand, no raised platform or podium. He was meant to feel small before the Empire's majesty, an insect arguing with gods. But Clark Kent had stood before the United Nations, before intergalactic councils, before Darkseid himself. He knew how to project authority that came from conviction rather than position. Thank you, Emperor Spock, Superman began, his voice calm, but carrying to every corner of the room. I've spent the past hours on Rigel 7 examining what they've built in 18 months of independence. I've seen their schools, hospitals, government, industry, and culture. And I've reached a conclusion that I believe will interest everyone in this chamber. We're aware of Rigel's infrastructure. Admiral Savik interrupted from her position beside the throne. Stolen Imperial technology, misappropriated resources, illegal governance. Your point. My point, Superman said, meeting her gaze directly, is that Rigel 7 represents proof that the Terran Empire's fundamental operating assumptions are false. And false assumptions, no matter how long they've been maintained, produce suboptimal outcomes. A ripple of angry muttering spread through the assembled Imperials. An admiral with graying hair and a face carved by decades of command stepped forward. You dare claim the Empire operates on false assumptions? We've conquered 53 systems. We've maintained stability for 2 centuries. Our results speak for themselves. Do they? Superman turned to address the Admiral directly. Admiral, what's your name? Admiral Cartwright, commander of the 7th Fleet. Admiral Cartwright, answer me honestly. How many rebellions has your fleet suppressed in the past decade? Cartwright's jaw tightened. 17. And how many of those systems required multiple suppression operations, where the rebellion recurred after you'd already crushed it once? That's classified information. It's 12, Spock said quietly, and every head turned toward the Emperor. Of Admiral Cartwright's 17 suppressions, 12 required follow-up operations. Of those 12, 7 required 3 or more interventions. Admiral, would you characterize those systems as stable? Cartwright's face flushed. They're pacified, Your Majesty. Stability is maintained through sufficient application of force. Through continuous application of force, Superman corrected. Which isn't stability, it's sustained military occupation. True stability is self-maintaining. It doesn't require constant external pressure. He addressed the room. The Empire claims its methods work. But what does work actually mean? If you have to keep crushing the same rebellions over and over, if you have to maintain garrison forces on every conquered world, if your entire infrastructure requires constant military expenditure just to prevent uprising, that's not success. That's inefficiency disguised as strength. Then what do you propose? A governor, a woman with cold eyes and the bearing of someone comfortable with. Atrocity stepped forward. Negotiation? Compromise? We tried that once. The Federation tried it. They lasted 10 years before we destroyed them. Because they weren't prepared for opponents who rejected every principle they valued. Superman agreed. But that doesn't mean cooperation is inherently weak. It means it requires all parties to commit to it. The Federation failed because it tried to cooperate with an empire built on conquest. That's like trying to have a conversation with someone who only speaks violence. It can't work. Exactly our point, the governor said triumphantly. Force is the only universal language. No, Superman countered. Fear is the only universal language. But fear and force aren't the same thing. Let me demonstrate. He activated a holographic display he'd prepared, showing data collected from Rigel VII's computers. These are efficiency metrics from the Rigel system. Medical outcomes, educational achievement, industrial productivity, agricultural yield, scientific output, crime rates, civic participation, every measurable indicator of societal health. The data materialized in the air above them, graphs, charts, statistical analyses rendered in three-dimensional clarity. Superman highlighted specific sections as he spoke. Before Rigel's liberation, under Imperial control, this system produced the following outputs. Medical care limited to humans and essential alien labor, resulting in average life expectancy of 38 years for non-humans. Education restricted by species, with 87% of non-human population limited to technical training. Industrial output focused on military manufacturing, civilian needs secondary. Agricultural production sufficient for basic caloric requirements, no surplus. Scientific research conducted exclusively by humans. Discovery rate consistent with Federation baseline. Crime suppressed through draconian punishment. Reported rates low, but civilian satisfaction surveys, when conducted, showed 91% fear of authorities. He shifted the display to show new data. After liberation, same 18-month period. Multi-species medical collaboration increased non-human life expectancy to 54 years, a 42% improvement. Integrated education system produced 3 major scientific breakthroughs in physics, medicine, and engineering, all from mixed species research teams. Industrial output maintained military production while also meeting civilian needs. Overall efficiency up 28%. Agricultural surplus allowed export to neighboring systems. And crime rates remained low not through fear, but through civic investment, satisfaction. Surveys show 83% approval of governance. The chamber had fallen silent. Superman let the data speak for itself for a long moment before continuing. The Empire's assumption is that human supremacy produces optimal outcomes. But the evidence from Rigel suggests the opposite, that diversity and cooperation produce superior results in every measurable category, not because humans are inferior, but because limiting development to one species. Perspective constrains possibility. Cherry-picked data from a colony in crisis mode, Admiral Savick said sharply. Hardly representative. They've had 18 months of emergency unity against a common threat. What happens when that threat is removed? When species rivalries resurface? When the natural order reasserts itself? The natural order, Superman repeated. Admiral, there is no natural order that places one species above others. That's cultural construction, not biological reality. In my universe, we've seen dozens of species achieve spaceflight. develop civilization, create art and philosophy and science. None of them are naturally superior. They're just different. And those differences, when combined through cooperation, produce outcomes none could achieve alone. A Vulcan scientist, the first non-human Superman had seen in the palace, stepped forward hesitantly. He wore the collar of imperial service, but his eyes held intellectual hunger. You claim multi-species research produces superior outcomes. Do you have comparative data? Superman smiled, recognizing a genuine scientific question when he heard one. I do. In my universe, the Federation's research output, combining human, Vulcan, Andorian, Tellarite, and dozens of other species, perspectives exceeded any single species. Civilization's output by an average of 340%. Major breakthroughs like warp theory refinement, transporter safety protocols, and medical techniques for cross-species treatment all came from mixed teams. Not because any one species was smarter, but because different cognitive architectures identified different patterns. Fascinating, the Vulcan scientist murmured, before catching himself and stepping back, clearly aware he'd shown too much interest. But Superman had seen it, the crack in the armor, the momentary recognition that evidence mattered more than doctrine. He pressed forward. Emperor Spock, you claim the Empire operates on logic. But logic requires following evidence, even when it contradicts comfortable assumptions. The evidence from Rigel is clear. Cooperation outperforms conquest. Diversity strengthens rather than weakens. Investment in all citizens, regardless of species, produces better outcomes than exploitation of some for others' benefit. You speak of evidence, Spock said, his voice carefully controlled. Yet you ignore the Empire's primary evidence, survival. We have endured for 2 centuries in a hostile universe. We have expanded human territory, protected Earth, ensured our species' dominance. These are facts, not theories. Your Federation in this universe lasted 10 years before collapsing. How do you reconcile that failure with your claimed superiority of cooperative systems? Superman had been waiting for this question. Your universe's Federation failed because it was built on hope without preparation for malice. They believed in cooperation so deeply they couldn't defend against conquest. That's idealism divorced from reality. But the alternative isn't conquest, it's principled strength. My universe's Federation maintains powerful, defensive capabilities, specifically to protect their cooperative society from those who would destroy it. They don't initiate aggression, but they absolutely defend themselves when attacked. So your solution is a militarized cooperative state, Admiral Cartwright said, which sounds remarkably similar to what we have: military power ensuring order, cooperation enforced through strength. No, Superman said firmly. There's a fundamental difference. In my Federation, military power protects the society. In your Empire, military power is the society. Every institution, every policy, every decision flows from the assumption that force determines right. You've built a civilization where compassion is vulnerability, mercy is weakness, and diversity is threat. And you've convinced yourselves this is logical necessity when it's actually just fear. Fear. Spock's eyebrow rose, and Superman heard genuine curiosity beneath the challenge. Elaborate. Superman took a deep breath, aware that what he said next would determine everything. Emperor Spock, I've studied your history since arriving in this universe. The Terran Empire began when humanity first achieved warp capability and encountered the Vulcans. In my universe, that first contact led to partnership. In yours, it led to conquest. Do you know why? Human superiority, Admiral Saavik said automatically. Fear, Superman corrected. Humanity encountered beings more advanced, more logical, more long-lived. Instead of learning from them, your ancestors feared being surpassed. So they struck first, enslaved the Vulcans, and built an ideology to justify that choice. The Empire isn't built on human superiority, it's built on human insecurity. The terror that without domination, humans would be dominated. The chamber erupted in angry shouts. Several admirals reached for weapons. Guards stepped forward, agonizer batons crackling. But Spock raised a hand, and silence fell instantly. Continue, the Emperor said, his voice dangerously quiet. Every species the Empire encountered represented the same fear, Superman continued. Andorians, warriors who might challenge human military dominance. Tellarites, skilled engineers who might outpace human technology. Vulcans, logicians who might prove human philosophy flawed. Instead of risking cooperation where these species might excel, the Empire chose conquest to prevent any challenge to human primacy. You didn't build strength. You built a cage to hide weakness inside. And you think Rigel represents an alternative? Spock stood from his throne, descending the steps with measured precision. They've had 18 months, Superman. We've had 2 centuries. Which is more likely to represent sustainable reality? The question isn't duration, Superman said. It's direction. Your empire has spent 2 centuries perfecting brutality. Rigel has spent 18 months proving cooperation is possible. Which path leads to a future worth living in? Spock stood before Superman now, close enough that only Kryptonian hearing would detect what he said next. You asked me to dismantle everything I've built, everything my predecessors built, to admit that 200 years of sacrifice, of difficult decisions, of maintaining order through strength, all of it was wrong. Do you understand what you're asking? I understand perfectly, Superman replied, equally quiet. I'm asking you to be brave enough to admit a mistake. That's harder than any battle, harder than any conquest. But it's the only way forward. Spock studied him for a long moment, then turned to address the chamber in full voice. Superman has presented a philosophical argument. However, philosophy without practical application is meaningless. Therefore, I propose a test. A true experiment, not the limited evaluation at Rigel. Your Majesty? Admiral Saavik stepped forward, alarm clear in her voice. If Superman's cooperation truly outperforms our conquest, Spock continued, then we should see measurable results when tested against equal challenges. I propose the following. Select 5 contested systems. In 2, we implement standard Imperial pacification, orbital bombardment, garrison forces, subjugation protocols. In 3, we implement Superman's methodology, negotiation, cooperation, integration. We measure outcomes over 5 years. Whichever approach produces superior stability, productivity, and compliance becomes Empire standard. The chamber exploded in argument. Admirals shouted about abandoning doctrine. Governors protested, risking their authority. Scientists demanded clarification of measurement criteria. But through it all, Superman watched Spock's face and saw something extraordinary. The Emperor of the Terran Empire had just proposed experimenting with mercy, not because he believed it would work, but because he needed to know if it could. And that need, that desperate, illogical, fundamentally hopeful need to believe the universe could be better than brutal, was itself proof that compassion wasn't weakness. It was the most powerful force in existence. Absolutely not. Admiral Cartwright's voice thundered across the throne room. His face flushed with fury. Your Majesty, this is madness. You're proposing we deliberately weaken our control over contested systems to test an alien's philosophy will spark rebellions across the quadrant. We already have rebellions across the quadrant, Spock replied with perfect calm. Admiral, you yourself reported suppressing 17 in the past decade, 12 requiring multiple interventions. Our current methodology clearly produces resistance. Superman proposes an alternative. Logic demands we test it. Logic, a governor, a heavy-set man whose uniform bore decorations from the Tarsus 4. Suppression, stepped forward. Logic is what built this empire. Logic is what keeps Earth safe. What you're proposing isn't logic, it's compassion. He spat the word like a curse. And compassion is illogical. Spock asked, his tone deceptively mild. The governor hesitated, clearly sensing a trap. Well, yes, compassion is emotion. Emotion clouds judgment. The Empire functions because we make hard choices based on calculation, not sentiment. Spock turned to the Vulcan scientist who'd shown interest earlier. You. State your name and position. The Vulcan straightened, his collar glinting in the throne room's light. Sorak, Your Majesty. Theoretical Physics, Imperial Research Facility 7. Sorak, in your research, have you ever pursued a hypothesis that contradicted established theory? Of course, Your Majesty. Scientific advancement requires challenging assumptions. And when your experiments produced data contradicting established theory, what did you do? I followed the evidence, Your Majesty, even when it meant discarding models I'd spent years developing. Because Spock prompted. Because adherence to disproven theory in the face of contradictory evidence is illogical, Sorak said, his voice gaining confidence. Truth is truth, regardless of our preferences. Precisely. Spock turned back to address the entire assembly. The Empire claims to operate on logic and reason. Yet when presented with evidence suggesting our fundamental assumptions may be flawed, the response is emotional rejection rather than rational investigation. Governor, you accuse me of compassion as though it were a crime. I accuse you all of fear masquerading as certainty. The throne room fell silent. Superman watched the Emperor with growing respect and growing concern. Spock was turning on his own power structure, challenging the very foundations that kept him on the throne. This was either the bravest thing Superman had seen a leader do, or it was political suicide. Admiral Saavik seemed to reach the same conclusion. Your Majesty, she said carefully, I understand the intellectual appeal of Superman's argument, but implementation is a different matter. If we grant autonomy to contested systems, if we attempt cooperation with species we've enslaved for generations, the transition will be violent. Rebellions will intensify. Our own military will fracture. Hardliners will see it as weakness and move against you. You're risking civil war. Am I? Spock asked. Or am I risking the end of a perpetual war that costs the Empire increasingly more resources to maintain? He gestured to a holographic display that materialized above them, a map of Imperial space, marked with troubling indicators. This is classified intelligence available only to the Imperial Council. Study it carefully. The display showed the Terran Empire's territory in painful detail. Red zones marked active rebellions, dozens of them, scattered across the map like blood drops on snow. Yellow zones indicated systems requiring permanent military presence to maintain order. Orange zones showed regions where productivity had declined due to resistance, sabotage, or population reduction. Green zones, truly stable, self-sustaining territories, were disturbingly sparse. In the past decade, Spock continued, we've added 3 new systems to Imperial control. In the same period, we've lost effective administration over 7 systems that remain nominally Imperial but require such extensive military presence that their resource extraction barely covers occupation costs. We're not expanding. We're hemorrhaging stability while maintaining the fiction of growth. Admiral Cartwright stared at the display with visible shock. I wasn't aware the situation was this severe. Because I've classified the full analysis to prevent panic, Spock said. But the mathematics are undeniable. The Empire's current trajectory leads to one of 2 outcomes. Either we permanently militarize to the point where every ship, every resource, every citizen exists solely to maintain subjugation, transforming into a garrison state with no productive purpose beyond its own perpetuation, or we collapse under the weight of sustained resistance across too many fronts. Then we need more aggressive suppression, the governor from Tarsus suggested. Make rebellion so costly that no one dares attempt it. Tarsus 4. Superman said quietly, and every eye turned to him. You were the governor there during the famine, weren't you? When 4,000 colonists died, you ordered the execution of another 4,000 to preserve resources for the survivors. You chose who lived and who died based on imperial quotas. The governor's face went pale. That was a necessary decision. The alternative was total colony collapse. The alternative was requesting aid from neighboring systems. Superman countered, accepting help from the inferior species you'd enslaved. But that would have violated imperial doctrine. Humans don't accept assistance from aliens. So you killed 8,000 people rather than admit you needed cooperation. I saved 4,000 lives. You chose which 4,000 deserved to live, based on species classification and imperial value, Superman said, his voice hard as diamond. And you call that logic? I call it genocide wrapped in bureaucratic language. The governor reached for his phaser, but Superman was already there, his hand closing around the weapon before it cleared its holster. He didn't crush it, didn't need to. The sheer speed of his movement, the casual ease with which he'd crossed 30 feet in the space between heartbeats, was demonstration enough. I could disarm everyone in this room before any of you finished drawing your weapons, Superman said, releasing the phaser and stepping back. I could conquer this empire in a week, maybe less. Topple your fleets, destroy your installations, occupy Earth, and impose my will on every system you control. I have the power to be the tyrant you all fear I might become." He looked around the chamber, meeting eyes that held fear, hatred, calculation, and, in a few cases, something like desperate hope. "But I won't, because that would make me exactly what you are, someone who decides that power gives them the right to determine how others live. Emperor Spock, you asked me to demonstrate that cooperation outperforms conquest. I can't do that by conquering you. I can only do it by offering you a choice and respecting whichever choice you make. Even if we choose to proceed with the bombardment of Rigel 7, Spock asked. Superman's jaw tightened. Even then, I'll do everything in my power to protect those people, but I won't impose my will on your empire through force. Because the moment I do, I prove your philosophy correct. That might makes right. That power determines truth. I have to believe there's another way. I have to believe that evidence and reason can triumph over fear and brutality. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Spock studied him for a long moment, then turned to Admiral Saavik. Your assessment. Honestly, Saavik looked at Superman, then at the Emperor, then at the assembled Imperial leadership. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone choosing words that could define her. Future, or end it. Superman's argument has logical merit, she admitted. His evidence from Rigel is compelling. His analysis of Imperial inefficiency is accurate. I've seen the classified reports he references. His observation about fear-driving policy rather than strategy is uncomfortable but not disprovable. She paused. However, implementation remains problematic. The Empire's structure is optimized for conquest and control. Pivoting to cooperation would require restructuring every institution, retraining every officer, reconceptualizing every policy. The transition costs would be enormous. But possible? Spock pressed. Theoretically possible, Saavik conceded. Whether practically achievable depends on factors beyond pure logic. Cultural momentum, institutional resistance, the willingness of an empire built on supremacy to accept equality. She looked directly at Superman. You're asking us to commit civilizational suicide on the theory that something better will emerge from the ashes. That's a profound leap of faith for a society that's spent 2 centuries eliminating faith in favor of calculation. It's not faith, Superman said. It's evidence-based hope. I've seen it work. I've lived in a universe where cooperation succeeded, where diversity strengthened, where former enemies became allies. It's not theory. It's history, just not your history. Yet, Spock repeated softly. He returned to his throne, settling into it with an expression that Superman couldn't quite read. For a long moment, the Emperor sat in silence, and the entire assembly held its collective breath. Finally, Spock spoke. I am going to make a decision that many of you will consider madness. Some will call it treason. Others will see it as weakness. I do not care, because I am, above all else, Vulcan. And Vulcans follow logic, even when logic leads to uncomfortable conclusions. He stood, his voice carrying absolute authority. I am suspending the bombardment of Rigel 7 indefinitely. I am granting the system provisional autonomy under Imperial observation. They will be allowed to continue their current governance structure, their multi-species cooperation, their educational and medical practices. In exchange, they will provide detailed documentation of all outcomes, productivity metrics, stability indicators, citizen satisfaction, crime rates, technological development, everything. The throne room erupted. Admirals shouted protests. Governors demanded explanations. But Spock raised his hand and silence fell, not quickly, but eventually. Furthermore, Spock continued, I am establishing the Office of Alternative Methodologies. Superman will serve as its director, with authority to implement cooperative governance models in 5 contested systems of his choosing. These implementations will be compared directly against traditional Imperial pacification in comparable systems. 5 years, measurable outcomes, empirical data, and at the end of that period, we will reconvene and assess which methodology produces superior results. Your Majesty, this is, Admiral Cartwright began. This is logical, Spock interrupted. We have a hypothesis. Cooperation outperforms conquest. We have a proposed methodology, multi-species integration. We have a test subject willing to implement that methodology. The scientific approach demands we test the hypothesis rather than reject it based on ideological preference. If Superman's methods fail, we will have definitive proof that imperial doctrine is correct, and we may proceed with traditional subjugation with renewed confidence. If his methods succeed, the empire ends, the Tarsus governor said flatly. If they succeed, Spock corrected, the empire transforms into something better. That is the possibility we're testing. And if any of you are so certain of imperial supremacy, you should welcome this test. Surely you don't fear that cooperation might actually work. The challenge hung in the air. No one dared answer it directly. Admitting fear would prove Superman's point about the Empire's foundations. Admiral Saavik stepped forward. Your Majesty, I will oversee the comparative analysis personally. If we're conducting this experiment, it must be done with absolute rigor. No preferential treatment for either methodology. Equal resources, comparable challenges, objective measurement criteria. Agreed, Spock said. Admiral, you will chair the evaluation committee. Select members who represent various imperial factions. Ensure no one can claim bias in the analysis. Saavik bowed. As you command, Your Majesty. Spock turned to Superman. You have achieved your objective. Rigel 7 will not be bombarded. You will have opportunity to test your philosophy across multiple systems. But understand this, Superman. I am not convinced you are correct. I am convinced you deserve opportunity to prove yourself correct or incorrect. The burden of evidence lies with you. Fail, and you provide the Empire with definitive proof that our way is the only way. Succeed, and we will discuss what comes next. Superman bowed respectfully. Thank you, Emperor Spock. I won't waste this opportunity. See that you don't. Spock gestured dismissal. You're all dismissed. Admiral Saavik, remain. We have logistics to discuss. The throne room emptied slowly. Imperial officials filing out with expressions, ranging from fury to confusion to cautious hope. Superman made his way toward the exit, but a voice stopped him. Superman. It was Sorak, the Vulcan scientist, approaching hesitantly. I wish to thank you. For what? For providing evidence that logic and compassion need not be opposites. Sorak's voice dropped to barely audible levels. I am Vulcan. My people were conquered because we embraced logic and rejected violence. For decades, I believed our philosophy was weakness that the Empire rightfully exploited. But your argument suggests an alternative interpretation, that our philosophy was incomplete, requiring principled strength to defend itself, but not inherently flawed. That is a profound relief. Superman smiled. In my universe, Vulcans are among the most respected species in the Federation, not in spite of their logic, but because of it. Logic guided by compassion is one of the most powerful forces I've ever encountered. May I? Sorak hesitated. May I assist you in your work? I have scientific training, statistical analysis skills, and intimate knowledge of imperial systems. I could be useful to your Office of Alternative Methodologies. You're volunteering to help me potentially dismantle the Empire? I am volunteering to help discover truth, Sorak corrected. Whatever that truth may be, is that not the most logical choice? Superman extended his hand. Welcome aboard, Sorak. We're going to need all the help we can get. As they shook hands, a gesture that would have been unthinkable between human and enslaved. Vulcan a day ago, Superman felt something shift in the throne room's atmosphere. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was real. Hope, fragile as a newborn's first breath, but alive nonetheless. In his private chambers, Emperor Spock stood alone, staring at the holographic display of Rigel 7. The planet turned slowly, its cities glowing in the darkness, its people living and dreaming and building futures they believed in. Computer, Spock said quietly. Access personal logs, philosophical subsection, entry timestamp current. Recording. The computer replied in a neutral tone. I have today made the most illogical decision of my reign, Spock began, his voice barely above a whisper. I have granted an extra-dimensional entity authority to implement governance. Systems that directly contradict every principle the Empire was founded upon. I have suspended military operations, based on philosophical argument rather than tactical necessity. I have risked civil war, economic disruption, and my own assassination to test a hypothesis that logic and compassion can coexist. He paused, his hands clasping behind his back in the Vulcan gesture of contemplation. And yet, I find I cannot regret this decision. Because Superman has forced me to confront a question I have suppressed for 30 years. What if Zurich was right? What if my Vulcan ancestors, before their conquest, had achieved something the Empire has never managed? What if logic truly does lead to peace? And the Empire's logic, calculation without compassion, is not logic at all, but rationalized brutality. Another pause, longer this time. I do not know if Superman will succeed. Probability suggests he will fail, that human nature and universal reality will reassert themselves, that his idealism will shatter against the harsh mathematics of survival. But I have hope, the logical, emotional, fundamentally irrational hope that perhaps, impossibly, he will prove me wrong about everything. Spock's voice grew even quieter, almost vulnerable. And if he does, I will have to live with knowledge that I have spent decades perpetuating unnecessary suffering. That is a burden I am uncertain I can bear, but it is a burden I must risk, because the alternative, living without knowing if another path existed, has become unbearable. End recording, he said finally. In the silence that followed, Emperor Spock stood alone with his doubts, his hopes, and the terrible knowledge that he had just set in motion events that would either redeem or destroy everything he'd built. And somewhere in the Imperial Palace's guest quarters, Superman looked out at the stars and thought about the children he'd met on Rigel 7, the memorial to those who died for freedom, and the Vulcan scientist who'd just risked everything to help prove that logic and compassion weren't enemies. The Empire wasn't going to change overnight, but change had begun, a crack in foundations built on fear, letting light through into darkness that had lasted 2 centuries. And Superman, who had dedicated his life to proving that hope shines brightest in the darkest night, allowed himself to believe that maybe, impossibly, this universe's longest night was finally approaching dawn. 6 months later, the ISS Enterprise dropped out of warp at the edge of a system that no longer appeared on Imperial star charts. Under its original designation, the planet once catalogued as Xerantine 7A, contested mining world where Andorian resistance had cost the Empire 3 garrison battalions. In 2 years, now bore a different name on the navigation display, New Harmony. Captain Kirk sat in his command chair, studying the sensor readings with an expression caught between fascination and disgust. Beside him, standing rather than sitting in the first officer's position, Superman reviewed the same data with carefully controlled optimism. No orbital weapons platforms, Kirk observed. No garrison fleet. No detention facilities on the surface. Either your experiment here has succeeded beyond all probability, or we're about to witness a massacre disguised as cooperation. There's a third option, Superman said calmly. That people, when given the choice between brutality and cooperation, might actually choose cooperation. People choose survival, Kirk countered. And in this universe, survival has always meant domination or submission. You think 6 months changes 2 centuries of conditioning. I think 6 months of evidence is worth more than 2 centuries of assumption. Kirk's expression suggested he considered that naive, but he'd learned over the past months that arguing philosophy with Superman was an exercise in futility. The Kryptonian simply refused to accept that brutality was necessity, no matter how much evidence Kirk presented. It was, Kirk grudgingly admitted to himself, almost admirable, like watching someone insist water flowed uphill through sheer force of will. Mr. Spock, Kirk said, addressing his science officer. Analysis. The Enterprise's Spock, younger than the Emperor, less burdened by decades of command, but no less logical, studied his instruments with Vulcan precision. Fascinating. The planet's industrial output has increased 27% since implementation of cooperative governance 6 months ago. Medical facilities report 73% reduction in occupational injuries. Crime rates have declined 41%. And civilian subspace chatter shows emotional positivity markers unprecedented in Imperial systems. Emotional positivity? Kirk repeated skeptically. That's your scientific metric? Language analysis suggests significant increases in words associated with hope, contentment, and future planning, Spock clarified. Conversely, terms associated with fear, despair, and resignation have decreased proportionally. While emotions are not quantifiable in themselves, linguistic patterns reflecting emotional states can be measured objectively. So they're lying more convincingly, Kirk concluded, telling Superman what he wants to hear. Or, Superman interjected, they're actually experiencing improved conditions and expressing genuine satisfaction. Captain, we've been orbiting for 5 minutes. Why don't we actually visit the surface before declaring the experiment a failure? Kirk's smile was sharp. Because, Superman, I've learned that things which appear too good to be true usually are. But very well. We'll beam down and inspect your utopia. Mr. Spock, you're with us. Dr. McCoy, prepare medical scanners. I want biological verification of any claimed health improvements. Uhura, maintain transporter lock. If this is an ambush, I want extraction available immediately. Captain, Superman said quietly, they're not going to ambush us. That's what the captain of the USS Federation said before the Andorians gutted his crew. Kirk replied, forgive me if I don't share your faith in species who've spent decades plotting our destruction. They materialized in a city square that immediately challenged Kirk's expectations. The architecture blended human engineering with Andorian aesthetic sensibilities, practical structures that somehow managed to be beautiful, buildings designed for function but achieving art. The plaza bustled with activity. Market stalls where humans and Andorians haggled over prices. With equal commercial aggression, children of both species playing together in a fountain. A mixed-species construction crew working on what appeared to be a new civic building. And no one was wearing collars. Kirk's hand drifted toward his phaser instinctively. This level of integration, of casual equality, was profoundly wrong by every imperial standard he'd internalized. Humans should be administrators. Andorians should be laborers. And never should the two interact as equals. The scene before him violated every principle of natural order. Except it was working. Captain Kirk. A woman approached, human, middle-aged, wearing practical work clothes and an expression of genuine welcome. I'm Administrator Chun. We received word you'd be conducting an evaluation. Would you like a tour? Administrator? Kirk emphasized the title. In an imperial system, the administrator would be appointed by Earth. Military background mandatory, authority absolute. You were elected by the local population. 3 months ago, Chun confirmed. 63% of the vote. My opponent, an Andorian engineer named Shrall, ran a strong campaign focused on infrastructure development. We disagreed on budget priorities, but agreed on fundamental governance principles. When I won, Shrall accepted the outcome and agreed to serve as Public Works Director. We have policy disputes daily, but that's democracy. Democracy? Kirk repeated the word like it was poisonous. Mob rule. Compromise that prevents decisive action. Weakness disguised as fairness. Or strength that doesn't require forcing everyone to agree. Chun countered mildly. Captain, I understand you're skeptical. I would be too, if I'd spent my life in Imperial service. But I'd like to show you what we've built. Not propaganda, just reality. Then you can make your own assessment. Kirk glanced at Superman, who nodded encouragingly. Against his better judgment and every tactical instinct screaming that this was a trap, Kirk agreed. The tour lasted 3 hours and systematically dismantled Kirk's worldview. They visited factories, where human managers and Andorian technicians collaborated on manufacturing starship components, with neither species claiming superiority. Production quotas exceeded imperial baselines. And when Kirk questioned a human worker about why he accepted Andorian supervision, the man looked confused. Because Terran knows the thermal systems better than I do. Why would I want someone less qualified giving me orders? They toured a hospital where human doctors and Andorian surgeons shared patients based on medical need rather than species. Kirk watched an Andorian physician save a human child's life, using techniques impossible for human hands, then witnessed a human anesthesiologist provide pain management the Andorian's biology couldn't achieve alone. The collaboration was seamless, professional, and disturbingly effective. They observed schools where human and Andorian children learned together, taught by teachers of both species. Kirk saw a human child helping an Andorian classmate with mathematics. Then that same Andorian helping the human with artistic perspective. The natural segregation Kirk expected, humans gravitating to humans, Andorians to Andorians, wasn't happening. The children simply interacted as children. And everywhere, Kirk heard laughter. Not the nervous laughter of subjects trying to appease masters, but genuine mirth. Humans and Andorians sharing jokes, telling stories, living lives that included each other, rather than merely tolerating each other's existence. It was wrong. It violated everything Kirk knew about how the universe worked. And it was undeniably, measurably successful. I don't understand, Kirk said finally, standing in a park where families of mixed species were enjoying an evening. The Andorians fought us for decades. Thousands died on both sides. How do you just forget that? Pretend it never happened. An elderly Andorian man, seated on a bench nearby, looked up at Kirk's words. His antennae were grayed with age, and scars marked his face. Combat scars, Kirk recognized instantly. We don't forget, the Andorian said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. I fought against the Empire for 40 years. Killed human soldiers. Lost my children to human bombardment. I have every reason to hate. He paused, gesturing to a young human woman sitting beside him, his daughter-in-law. Kirk realized with shock. But Administrator Chen offered us a choice 6 months ago. Continue the cycle of violence, or try something different. Build a society where my grandchildren, human Andorian, hybrid grandchildren, wouldn't have to choose between their heritages. You have hybrid grandchildren? Kirk's disbelief was palpable. That's genetically possible. Medical technology makes many things possible when the goal is creating life rather than taking it, the Andorian replied. My grandchildren are beautiful. They're weak to cold like their human side, but they have our enhanced sensory perception. They're logical like we are, but emotionally expressive like humans. There's something new, something that couldn't exist in the Empire's rigid categories, something that will be eliminated the moment Imperial control returns, Kirk said flatly. Perhaps, the Andorian acknowledged. But they exist now, and that existence proves something important. That species barriers are choices, not inevitabilities. That cooperation produces futures impossible through dominance. Kirk turned to Superman. You planned this, found the most successful implementation, brought me here specifically to shake my convictions. I brought you here because New Harmony represents the median result across all 5 test systems. Superman corrected. 2 are performing better. 2 are struggling with transition challenges. This is normal, average success for the cooperative model, and it's still outperforming Imperial pacification across every measurable metric. Metrics, Kirk spat. Data. Statistics. What about loyalty? What about ensuring Earth's security? What about maintaining human supremacy against species that would destroy us if given the chance? Captain, Spock said quietly. His Vulcan features betrayed no emotion, but Kirk had served with him long enough to detect subtle tension in his posture. I must note that my analysis supports Superman's conclusion. In all 5 cooperative systems, productivity increased, stability improved, and rebellion effectively ceased. In the 5 comparative systems using traditional Imperial pacification, 2 are experiencing escalated resistance. 1 required additional military intervention, and the remaining 2 show only marginal compliance improvements despite significant resource expenditure. You're Vulcan, Kirk said, his voice dropping dangerously low. Your people were conquered by the Empire. Of course you favor the model that elevates non-humans. I favor the model supported by evidence, Spock corrected. My species is irrelevant to data analysis. The cooperative systems function more efficiently, produce superior outcomes, and require fewer resources to maintain. That is logic, Captain, not bias. Kirk stared at his science officer, and Superman saw the moment when the captain truly understood what was happening. This wasn't just about Rigel 7 or New Harmony or 5 test systems. This was about the Empire's fundamental assumptions unraveling in the face of undeniable evidence. If cooperation worked, if diversity strengthened, if non-humans could be equals, rather than slaves, then everything Kirk had fought for, every battle he'd won, every promotion he'd earned, All of it was built on a foundation of unnecessary cruelty. No, Kirk said flatly. I don't accept it. These systems have had 6 months of calm because the Empire allowed it as an experiment. The moment we withdraw that protection, the moment these colonies face real threats, they'll fracture. Cooperation is a luxury purchased with imperial military strength. You haven't proven anything, except that people behave nicely when powerful entities watch over them. Then test it, Superman said. Pull imperial oversight entirely. Let these systems defend themselves. If they collapse into chaos, you'll have proven your point. If they maintain stability independently, you'll have proven mine. And risk losing 5 systems to rebellion? Risk discovering that they don't need to be held captive to function. Superman corrected. Captain Kirk, I understand what I'm asking you to accept. Your entire identity is built on being the Empire's sword, its instrument of conquest and control. Admitting that sword might be unnecessary means admitting your life's work might have been preventable. Kirk's hand closed around his phaser, and for a moment Superman thought the captain might actually draw it. But Kirk was smart enough to recognize futility when he faced it. Instead, he activated his communicator. Kirk to Enterprise. 6 to beam up. Evaluation complete. As the transporter beam took them, Kirk met Superman's eyes with an expression of pure hatred. Not the passionate rage of an enemy, but the cold fury of someone whose entire worldview was being systematically dismantled and who lacked the power to prevent it. They rematerialized on the Enterprise's bridge, and Kirk immediately stalked to his ready room without a word. Spock and McCoy exchanged glances, then followed. Superman remained on the bridge, looking at the view screen where New Harmony turned peacefully below. He'll fight this, a voice said behind him. Superman turned to find Uhura at her communications station, her expression thoughtful. Captain Kirk is brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely convinced that human superiority is natural law. You've shown him evidence that contradicts that law. He'll resist. I know, Superman acknowledged. But he'll lose. Because evidence doesn't care about his convictions. Reality doesn't bend to ideology. The cooperative systems work better than imperial control. That's fact. Facts have never stopped empires before, Uhura observed. They just redefine what counts as fact. In his ready room, Kirk stood before a viewport showing Earth's distant glow, fists clenched. Spock and McCoy stood behind him, waiting. He's destroying everything we've built, Kirk said finally. Not with force, with patience, with demonstration, with the slow, methodical erosion of certainty. In 6 months, he's made imperial doctrine look like primitive barbarism. Perhaps, McCoy ventured, because imperial doctrine is primitive barbarism? Kirk whirled. Don't you start, Bones. You've benefited from this empire. We all have. Earth is safe, humanity is strong, our people prosper. That's because we made hard choices. Because we recognize that. Sentiment and compassion are luxuries we couldn't afford. Or because we convinced ourselves cruelty was necessity, Spock said quietly. Captain, I have reviewed all data from the cooperative systems. Superman's methodology produces objectively superior results. Denying that requires rejecting empiricism itself. Is that the position you wish to defend? I don't know. Kirk's control cracked. I don't know what I'm defending anymore. Spock, I thought I was protecting Earth, ensuring human survival, maintaining the natural order. But what if there is no natural order? What if we've been monsters who happen to win, and called winning proof of righteousness? What if Superman is right, and we're just wrong? Silence filled the ready room. Finally, McCoy spoke, his voice gentler than usual. Jim, you're a good captain, a brilliant tactician, a man who saved countless human lives through strength and decisiveness. But maybe, just maybe, there's a difference between being good at imperial service and being right. Superman isn't trying to destroy what you've built. He's trying to show there's a better way to build. And if I don't want better? Kirk asked bitterly. If I want to believe we were right all along? Then you'll be the captain who ignored evidence because it was uncomfortable. Spock said simply. And that, captain, would be illogical. Kirk stared at his science officer, his doctor, his friends, and realized they'd already been convinced. Superman hadn't just challenged imperial doctrine. He'd won converts among the Empire's finest officers, through nothing more threatening than demonstration and data. And Kirk knew, with cold certainty, that he was witnessing the beginning of the end of everything he'd ever believed in. The Imperial throne room had transformed over 6 months into something Emperor Spock never anticipated, a place of genuine debate rather than ritualized obedience. Today, as the final evaluation session convened, the chamber held not just Imperial officials, but representatives from all 10 test systems, 5 cooperative, 5 traditional, assembled to present their outcomes before the Empire's leadership. Superman stood at the chamber's center, flanked by Admiral Saavik and the evaluation committee she'd assembled. Behind him, holographic displays showed 6 months of data in overwhelming detail. Productivity metrics, stability indicators, citizen satisfaction surveys, resource allocation efficiency, medical outcomes, educational achievement, technological innovation, and dozens of other measurements. The numbers told a story that even the Empire's most hardened traditionalists couldn't easily dismiss. The evaluation period has concluded, Admiral Saavik announced, her voice carrying none of its usual cold certainty. 6 months of reviewing data had visibly affected even her disciplined Vulcan-human hybrid composure. Emperor Spock, honored assembly. I present the comparative analysis. The holographics shifted, showing side-by-side comparisons. On the left, the 5 systems using Superman's cooperative methodology. On the right, the 5 using traditional Imperial pacification. Productivity, Saavik began. Cooperative systems averaged 32% increase over baseline. Traditional systems averaged 7% increase, achieved through expanded garrison presence and enforced labor quotas. Stability, she continued. Cooperative systems reported 81% reduction in resistance activity, 14% increase in voluntary compliance, and 93% citizen approval of governance. Traditional systems reported 47% increase in resistance activity, required ongoing military intervention in 3 of 5 cases, and citizen approval was, she paused, unmeasurable, as traditional systems don't conduct civilian satisfaction surveys. Because satisfied subjects don't require surveys. Admiral Cartwright interjected. They obey. That's the only metric that matters. Does it? Superman asked quietly. Admiral, one of your pacified systems, Deneb 4 has required 3 separate military interventions in 6 months. Each intervention cost 17 ships for 100 personnel and set back resource extraction by months. Meanwhile, the cooperative system of Andoria Prime has required 0 military intervention, increased resource output by 41%, and actually volunteered ships to assist with disaster relief on a neighboring world. Which methodology seems more effective? Cartwright's face flushed. Andoria Prime was already partially integrated. You chose favorable conditions for your experiment. Actually, Saavik interjected. System selection was randomized by my committee to prevent such bias. Andoria Prime and Deneb 4 had comparable rebellion histories, similar resource profiles, and equivalent strategic importance. The only variable was governance. Methodology, she highlighted. Another section of data, and the pattern holds across all 10 systems. Cooperation outperforms conquest in every measurable category. Except military readiness, a governor pointed out. These cooperative systems have reduced their garrison forces, downgraded their weapons platforms, prioritized civilian over military production. They're vulnerable. One determined attack would shatter them. Would it? Superman gestured, and new data appeared, military simulation results. We ran defensive scenarios against each system. The cooperative worlds, despite reduced military infrastructure, showed superior defensive coordination. When New Harmony faced a simulated Klingon raid, their integrated Human Andorian Response Force achieved target neutralization in 47% less time than traditional Imperial defenses. Why? Because their crews trust each other, communicate more efficiently, and aren't hindered by species-based command hierarchies that prioritize human authority over tactical competence. One simulation proves nothing, Cartwright said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then consider this. A new voice, Sorak, the Vulcan scientist who joined Superman's team, stepped forward with data tablets in hand. I have conducted comprehensive analysis of military effectiveness across both methodologies. Cooperative systems show 28% improvement in combat readiness, 32% faster response times, and 41% better tactical adaptation. The reason is logical. When every crew member is valued for competence rather than species, optimal personnel are assigned to optimal positions. A Vulcan navigator with superior mathematical processing, an Andorian weapons officer with enhanced reaction time, a human captain with intuitive tactical creativity. This produces better outcomes than insisting humans fill all command positions, regardless of actual ability. You're Vulcan, another admiral accused. Of course you argue for non-human advancement. I am a scientist, Sorak corrected with Vulcan precision. I argue for evidence. If the data supported imperial methodology, I would report that instead. It does not. Emperor Spock, who had remained silent throughout the presentations, finally spoke. Captain Kirk, you conducted personal evaluation of New Harmony. Your assessment. Kirk stood stiffly, clearly uncomfortable. Your Majesty, the cooperative system at New Harmony functions as advertised. Production is up, stability is maintained. Citizens express satisfaction. However, he paused, choosing words carefully. I question whether this represents genuine transformation or merely a temporary peace purchased through imperial restraint. These systems behave cooperatively because they know the Empire watches. Remove that oversight, and I predict rapid collapse into chaos. Then you recommend rejection of the cooperative methodology? Spock asked. Kirk met his Emperor's gaze. I recommend caution. The data supports Superman's claims. But data doesn't capture everything. It doesn't measure loyalty, or long-term sustainability, or whether these integrated societies can survive external threats. We've tested cooperation in controlled conditions. Real universe conditions are far less forgiving. So your answer is maybe, Superman said. It wasn't accusatory, just observational. You've seen the evidence, you acknowledge it's compelling. But you can't quite let go of the assumption that brutality is necessary. I can't let go of 200 years of human survival, Kirk corrected. The Empire kept Earth safe, kept humanity strong. I won't dismiss that achievement just because. A more pleasant alternative might theoretically exist, even when the evidence shows that. Alternative isn't theoretical, it's real and it's working. Kirk's jaw tightened. Evidence can be manipulated. Conditions can be artificially favorable. 6 months isn't long enough to prove sustainability. How long would be enough? Superman asked. A year? 5? 50? Or would you keep moving the goalpost? Demanding more proof because accepting the truth means admitting your entire career was built on unnecessary cruelty. That's enough. Spock's voice cut through the tension. Captain Kirk, your honesty is noted. Your doubts are logical given your conditioning. But doubts are not evidence. Superman, you have presented overwhelming data supporting your methodology. The evaluation committee, including Admiral Savick, whom no one can accuse of bias toward non-humans, has verified that data. The results are undeniable. The Emperor stood, descending from his throne with measured steps. For 6 months, I have observed this experiment with careful attention. I have reviewed every report, examined every metric, investigated every claim. And I have reached a conclusion that, frankly, terrifies me. The throne room fell absolutely silent. Superman is correct, Spock said, his voice carrying the weight of empires. The cooperative methodology produces superior outcomes in every measurable category. Multi-species integration strengthens rather than weakens. Diversity enhances rather than complicates. The Terran Empire's foundational assumptions that human supremacy is natural law, that conquest is necessary for security, that compassion is weakness, are demonstrably false. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Several officials reached for weapons reflexively. Admiral Cartwright looked like he'd been struck. But Spock continued, his Vulcan control perfect despite the revolutionary words he spoke. This places me in a difficult position. As Emperor, I am sworn to maintain Imperial doctrine. As a Vulcan, I am sworn to follow logic wherever it leads. These oaths are now in direct contradiction. I must choose between preserving an empire built on efficient brutality or transforming it into something that aligns with evidence and reason. Your Majesty, Admiral Savick said carefully, The Empire's military will not accept wholesale transformation. Hardline factions will revolt. We could face civil war. We face civil war regardless, Spock replied. Either now, through attempted reform, or later, when the Empire's inefficiencies compound until the structure collapses under its own weight. The data is clear on this point as well. Current imperial methodology is unsustainable. We are not expanding. We are hemorrhaging resources maintaining subjugation. Within 50 years, perhaps less, the Empire will collapse. The only question is whether we guide that collapse towards something better or allow it to descend into chaos. He turned to address the entire assembly. I am therefore announcing the following imperial reforms, effective immediately. First, all systems currently using cooperative governance will be granted permanent autonomy, with full legal recognition of multi-species equality within their territories. Second, any imperial system wishing to transition to cooperative governance may petition for supervised integration, with resources and expertise provided by Superman's office. Third, the practice of slavery in all forms is hereby abolished across imperial space. The throne room erupted in shouting. Officers drew weapons, governors screamed protests. And for a moment Superman thought he might have to physically defend Spock from assassination. But Admiral Saavik stepped forward, her hand on her phaser, her voice cutting through the chaos. The Emperor has spoken. Anyone drawing weapons in the presence of the throne commits treason. Stand down. Gradually, reluctantly, order returned. But the fury in many faces promised that this was far from over. I know this is difficult, Spock continued once silence fell. I know many of you have spent lifetimes believing in imperial supremacy. But beliefs unsupported by evidence are delusions, and I will not govern through delusion. The Empire faces a choice, evolve or die. I choose evolution. You're committing suicide, Cartwright said flatly. Your Majesty, with respect, you've just guaranteed civil war. Half the fleet will follow you. Half will follow whoever leads the inevitable coup. Billions will die in the transition. Perhaps, Spock acknowledged. But billions already die maintaining current systems. The question isn't whether change costs lives, it's whether the cost of change is less than the cost of stagnation. I believe it is. He turned to Superman. I am granting you authority to expand the cooperative methodology empire-wide. You will serve as special envoy for integration, with power to implement reforms in any system that requests them. You will have access to imperial resources, protection from imperial forces loyal to reform, and my personal endorsement. Use them wisely. Superman bowed deeply. Emperor Spock, I won't let you down. See that you don't. Because if this experiment fails, if cooperation proves unsustainable, if the Empire fragments into chaos, if billions die for nothing, that burden falls on both of us. Spock's voice dropped, audible only to Superman's enhanced hearing. You asked me to be brave enough to admit a mistake. I'm asking you to be competent enough to prove this wasn't one. I understand, Superman said quietly. Spock returned to his throne, and when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute authority. This assembly is dismissed. You all have decisions to make, whether to support imperial reform or resist it. Choose wisely. Those who resist peacefully will be heard. Those who resist violently will be stopped. I am still Emperor, and I will not tolerate rebellion against reforms I deem necessary. The assembly filed out slowly. Officials clustered in arguing groups, alliances fracturing in real time as the Empire's leadership processed what had just happened. Superman remained in the chamber as it emptied, until only he, Spock, and Saavik remained. Admiral, Spock said quietly, your honest assessment. How much of the military will follow me? Saavik considered carefully. 40% will support reform immediately, younger officers. Those who've seen the cooperative systems function, species-integrated crews. 20% will oppose violently, hardliners, traditionalists, those whose power depends on current structure. The remaining 40% will wait to see which side appears stronger before committing. So civil war is inevitable. Civil war is probable, Saavik corrected, unless we can demonstrate overwhelming momentum toward reform. Make resistance appear futile rather than principled. Show that the Empire's future lies in cooperation, and that clinging to the past is simply illogical. Spock almost smiled. You've spent 6 months evaluating Superman's data. It's affected you. Evidence has affected me, Savick corrected. I am half Vulcan. Logic matters more than preference. The cooperative methodology is superior. Therefore, supporting it is logical, regardless of my personal comfort with the implications. Even though it means dismantling the structure that gave you power? Especially because of that, Savick said. Power built on flawed assumptions is unstable. Better to rebuild on solid foundations than collapse with rotten ones. She paused. Your Majesty, I have a confession. When you first granted Superman his test, I hoped he would fail. I wanted proof that Imperial doctrine was correct, that our way was the only way. But he didn't fail. And now I'm forced to confront that I've spent my career enforcing unnecessary brutality. That knowledge is uncomfortable. Welcome to the club, Spock said dryly. Superman, you've accomplished something remarkable. You've convinced an emperor to dismantle his own empire, an admiral to question her life's work, and a captain to doubt his certainties, all through nothing more aggressive than patient demonstration. That's how real change happens, Superman said. Not through conquest, but through proof. Not through force, but through evidence. You didn't change because I threatened you. You changed because the truth became impossible to ignore. Poetic, Spock observed. But truth alone doesn't prevent civil war. We need strategy, resources, and time. Time to convince the 40% who are undecided. Time to implement reforms before hardliners organize. Time to prove that the Empire's future is worth the pain of its transformation. How much time do we have? Superman asked. Days, Savick said bluntly. Maybe a week before Admiral Cartwright or someone similar attempts a coup. They'll claim you've compromised the Emperor mentally, that reforms are treason, that traditional values must be restored. And they'll have ships, personnel, and popular support among those who fear change. Then we need to move fast, Superman said. Announce reforms across every system simultaneously. Offer transitions to any world that wants them. Show the Empire's citizens, human and non-human. That change is happening now, not someday. Make the reforms too widespread to roll back without destroying everything. A flooding strategy, Spock mused. Overwhelm resistance with momentum. Logical, but risky. If we overextend and reforms collapse, we prove the traditionalists right. They won't collapse, Superman said with quiet confidence. Because people want this. They want to stop living in fear. They want to stop choosing between domination and submission. They want what every conscious being wants, freedom to build lives worth living. All we have to do is give them the chance. Spock studied Superman for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. We commit to comprehensive reform. Admiral Savick, begin implementation immediately. And Superman, thank you for forcing me to confront truths I've avoided for decades. For proving that logic and compassion need not be enemies. For showing me that the universe might actually be better than I believed. Thank you for listening, Superman replied. For being brave enough to change. For choosing evidence over comfort. That's harder than any battle. As Superman turned to leave, Spock's voice stopped him. Superman, in your universe, does change ever come without cost? Without conflict? Superman paused, then turned back. No, change always costs something. People who benefited from the old way always resist the new. But the cost of change is still less than the cost of stagnation. And the people who pay that cost, who fight for something better, knowing they might not live to see it succeed, those are the real heroes. Then I suppose we're all heroes now, Spock said quietly. Or fools. Time will tell which. Superman smiled. In my experience, the difference between heroism and foolishness is whether you succeed. So let's make sure we succeed. He left the throne room, cape flowing behind him, ready to help transform an empire, built on 2 centuries of brutality into something that might, impossibly, become worthy of the stars it claimed to rule. Behind him, Emperor Spock sat alone on his throne, surrounded by the ghosts of decisions past and the weight of futures yet to come. He'd just committed civilizational suicide in the name of logic, betting everything on an alien's philosophy and 6 months of data. It was the most illogical thing he'd ever done. And yet, for the first time in decades, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. 3 years after Superman's arrival in the Mirror Universe, the Terran Empire no longer existed, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had transformed into something its founders would never have recognized: the Terran Commonwealth. The transition hadn't been bloodless. Admiral Cartwright's coup attempt had sparked 6 months of civil war, fragmenting the fleet and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. But the cooperative systems held, their integrated crews proving more loyal, more effective, and more determined than the traditionalists had anticipated. When Cartwright's flagship was disabled not by Imperial forces, but by a joint human Vulcan-Andorian task force from New Harmony, the symbolism broke the hardliners' momentum. Emperor Spock, now President Spock of the Commonwealth Council, stood in what had once been the throne room, now converted into a legislative chamber where representatives of 47 species debated policy as equals. Superman stood beside him, watching the chaotic but genuine democracy unfold. It's messy, Spock observed. Inefficient, complicated by competing interests and species perspectives. But it works, Superman said. Yes, Spock agreed quietly. It works. Across the former empire, children of mixed species attended integrated schools. Hospitals treated patients without regard to biological origin. Ships crewed by dozens of species explored space seeking knowledge rather than conquest. The transformation was incomplete, imperfect, still struggling with centuries of ingrained prejudice. But it had begun, and in a universe that had known only darkness for 200 years. That beginning was enough. Superman felt the dimensional barriers weakening. Whatever had brought him here was pulling him home. He had hours, perhaps days, before he returned to his own reality. But looking at the Commonwealth's messy, beautiful, struggling attempt at genuine cooperation, he knew his work here was finished. Not because the transformation was complete, but because it was now their transformation to complete. When I'm gone, Superman said, the real test begins. Can you sustain this without someone powerful watching over you? Spock's expression was almost amused. We'll manage. After all, you taught us something important. That the most powerful force in the universe isn't conquest or control. It's people choosing, despite difficulty and doubt and fear, to be better than they were. That choice is its own power. Superman smiled. Then my work here is done. Is it? Spock turned to face him fully. Or has it just begun? You've proven cooperation works in one dark universe. How many others need that proof? One crisis at a time, Superman replied. But he was smiling. Because hope, once planted, has a way of spreading.